Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we drift into quiet backstreets of ancient Rome, far from the marble temples and grand forums. Our story belongs not to emperors or generals, but to someone the world forgot, someone whose days were long and whose nights were longer still. So now, take a deep breath, let the weight of the day melt from your shoulders, dim the lights, close your eyes, and let the hush of history carry you away. The room was always quietest in the moments just before dawn, when even the alley cats stopped yowling, and the drunks had long since collapsed in the gutters, and it was in that soft, colorless hour that Lucilia first stirred beneath the ruffled blanket that scratched more than it warmed. Her body curled like a column upon the creaking wooden cot that barely held together beneath her weight, the mattress beneath her thin from too many years of use and too many nights that had ended with aching joints and the stale scent of wine, sweat, and regret soaked deep into the stuffing. And as her eyes fluttered open, not with urgency but with the dull inevitability of routine, she found herself again staring at the warped ceiling beams of the tenement above the butcher's stall, beams that bent and sagged as if weary from years of carrying other forgotten lives just like hers. And though she always told herself she would rise slowly and stretch, today, as on most days, she merely sat up, with a groan, her bare feet brushing the cracked clay floor as she reached for the small ceramic cup of water that tasted faintly of mold and old iron, sipping just enough to moisten her throat before rubbing the sleep from her eyes and beginning, as she always did, to prepare herself for another day that would look almost exactly like the last. Around her, the narrow room revealed itself slowly in the shifting gray light leaking through the shutters, a space no wider than a merchant's card end, cluttered with the sparse remnants of her life. A cracked bronze mirror, a comb missing half its teeth, a bundle of faded tunics folded beneath a woven reed basket of medicinal herbs gifted by an old lover she no longer remembered, and in the corner, a chipped oil lamp with a wick burned low, reminding her that she would need to visit the lamp seller again soon, though she hated how he looked at her with that mix of pity and familiarity, as if her trade gave him permission to see her more closely than he should. But such things were unavoidable in Sabura, where walls were thin and secret impossible, and even in the stillness of morning, she could already hear the stirrings of life beneath and around her, the soft scuff of sandals against stone, the rattling of shutters being unlatched, the hiss of hot coals being revived in braziers, and the quiet murmur of a woman arguing with her husband below, their words muffled but their tones sharp and tired, as if the quarrel had begun years ago and merely paused each night for sleep. Lucilia breathed in slowly, her ribs rising beneath the loose cloth of her night tunic, and exhaled with the same slow patience she'd learned years ago, back when she still imagined her life might change, back when she still thought she might marry or leave Rome, or grow old selling perfume rather than herself. But those dreams had faded the way smells faded from an empty amphora, leaving only faint traces behind, too dim to follow. She stood, at last, joints clicking softly in the morning hush, and moved toward the wash basin where she splashed her face with cold water that made her flinch each time, and then she dried herself at the edge of her sheet, tying her hair back with a strip of linen that had once been part of a toga someone had paid her to wear and then to remove. And as she straightened her back and looked into the bronze mirror once more, she saw not a courtesan or a disgrace or even a woman, but simply a person, surviving, a pair of eyes that no longer asked much from the world and a mouth that smiled only when it served a purpose, her expression blank as she began to dress, pulling the simple robe over her shoulders and adjusting the folds with automatic precision, her fingers skilled not because of pride, but because sloppiness invited judgment, and judgment threatened coin, and coin was the only thing standing between her and the gutters outside, where others like her had already lost the strength to pretend they were something more. And so she began her morning, not with joy or hope or even hunger, but with the quiet ritual of becoming presentable for the world, of stepping into the role that others expected her to play, of hiding every softness and replacing it with polish, with scent, with posture, and above all with silence, because silence had a way of protecting her, of shielding her from questions and memories, and the dangerous luxury of being seen too clearly by anyone. And as the light crept more boldly through the shutters, and the noises of the street below grew louder, carts rolling over cobblestones, children shrieking, a vendor shouting about olives, Lucilia took a final look around her small, rented room, as though ensuring it still existed, and then she opened the door and stepped into the stairwell, with a scent of boiled cabbage, urine, and cheap incense rose up from the depths, curling around her like an old, unpleasant friend, and with each step downward, toward the city's waking streets, she left behind the last fragments of rest, preparing herself for the long, shapeless hours to come, hours that would stretch endlessly across the day, hours filled with the quiet repetition of tasks she did not choose but knew by heart, hours that began now. In the dim, shadowed doorway where the tenement met the alley, and with a faint red chalk mark on the wall, renewed each morning by the landlord's son, reminded all who passed what kind of woman lived. Here and what services she offered for a few denarii and a bit of discretion. The morning light in Sabura had a way of exposing everything without warmth, a pale, chalky glare that bounced off the crumbling walls of tenements and turned the dust in the air into something almost tangible, and as Lucilia stepped out into it, she pulled her robe closer to the collar, not because the summer air was cold, far from it, but because some part of her always bristled at the exposure, at the way the streets looked back at her with knowing eyes, even when they were empty of people. Her sandals clicked softly on the uneven stones as she walked, moving with a grace that was neither hurried nor lazy, the kind of practiced pace that suggested purpose without urgency. Because in her world, looking busy was safer than looking idle, and looking idle was safer than looking lost, and no one in Sabura could afford to look lost for long without being swallowed by something darker than hunger. Around her, the neighborhood stirred to life with a quiet that preceded the louder hours to come. Vendors setting up their carts with creaking wheels and muttered curses. Children darting barefoot through alleys with crusts of bread clutched in their hands. Laundry flapping between buildings like pale pennants of surrender, and here and there, the glint of a Roman helmet as a bored guard leaned against a shaded wall, scratching his chin and pretending not to notice the exchange of coins between a fish seller and a city official pretending to inspect permits. Lucilia walked past all of it without pause, her eyes drifting across it all, but never resting too long. For she had long ago learned that observation could be mistaken for interest, and interest can invite trouble, and trouble in Sabura often came not with a warning but with closed fist or a whisper in the wrong ear. And so she kept walking until a narrow alley opened onto a slightly wider street, with a smell of wet stone mixed with a stronger odor of stale oil and iron-rich water, and there, tucked behind a half-collapsed archway of brick and crumbling plaster, stood the entrance to the small communal bathhouse she visited each morning. Not a bathe, for such indulgences cost more than she wished to spend, but to sit in the dry vestibule near the entrance, where the heat from within spilled outward and the women gathered in soft clusters to speak of nothing and everything, their words wrapping the space like steam. Lucilia entered with her usual nod to the old man, who dozed near the door, a former slave whose job it was to keep the floors swept and the coins counted, and she took her place on a worn stone bench just inside, settling her robe around her knees and adjusting her posture with unconscious elegance, for this too was part performance, being seen without seeming to demand it, hearing without seeming to listen, offering the illusion of presence without the risk of being drawn in too deeply. Around her, the women's voices rose and fell like the tide, soft laughter, sharp, gossip, weary complaint about husbands and coin and aching backs, the rhythm of a world that never changed much but still insisted on being discussed. And Lucilia listened not for content but for tone, for the subtle shifts in voice that told her who was frightened, who was desperate, who might be willing to pay for company tonight, if only to forget something heavy, something unbearable, something shameful. And it was in this gentle scanning of a human current that Lucilia earned her living, more than in any act of intimacy. This quiet reading of the soul behind the speech, this gentle sifting of want from need, of weakness from danger. Occasionally a woman would nod to her or offer a faint smile, not unkindly, for they all knew who she was and what she did, but such knowledge in Rome was like knowing that the gutters carried waste. It was accepted, tolerated, occasionally avoided, but never truly questioned, and in this unspoken arrangement, Lucilia found a kind of safety, a fragile shield made of shared silences and mutual weariness. And so she remained there for nearly an hour, warming herself with the heat from the baths and the gentle noise of mundane lives being voiced into the damp air, until the angle of the sunlight shifted, and the noise from the street grew louder and more frantic, and she knew it was time to leave, not because she was finished, but because the day had begun in earnest, and too much stillness could turn into suspicion. And suspicion was something. She could never afford to carry with her when she stepped back into the world of open eyes and clinking coins and careful, practiced smiles. And so she rose, smoothing her robe again, and stepped out into the noise of the day, the heat rising from the stones now, her shadow trailing behind her as she moved back toward the street, thinking not of who she might meet today, but of who might need her in ways they would not admit aloud. The street market bloomed like a fever along the edge of the Subura, not in neat rows or orderly stalls, but in unruly clusters of sound and smell and sweat, its arteries clogged with people moving in every direction and yet arriving nowhere, a living maze of vendors hawking dried figs, salted fish, dyed fabrics, cracked pottery, and stolen goods disguised as bargains, the air thick with the tang of vinegar and onions and something sweeter, perhaps roasted dates, or perhaps only the illusion of them drifting from a distant corner where someone had burned sugar to hide the scent of rot. And Lucilia, stepping into this throbbing artery of Roman life, did not slow down, nor did she quicken her pace. She simply adjusted the set of her shoulders, the sway of her hips, the rhythm of her stride, small changes so subtle they could pass for natural movement, yet honed over years of repetition to catch the corner of a man's eye without ever seeming to beg for it. She moved like mist, her presence felt more than seen, not flamboyant, not vulgar, but noticeable in that quiet way that made men turn a second time, uncertain whether they had glimpsed a familiar face or merely imagined it. And that uncertainty, that moment of hesitation, was all she needed to plant the seed. She did not smile, not yet, and she did not speak, for this was the hour of watching, not working. It was in these slow, measured glances that she would gather the names, the faces, the silences of the day, storing them like coins in a hidden purse within her mind. She passed a fishmonger, who never looked at her unless his wife wasn't watching, and today his wife was, arms crossed, brow furrowed. So he did not raise his eyes, and she passed a fruit seller with a crooked nose who sometimes gave her bruised apples when he had no coin. And then she passed a wine vendor whose stall had been recently rebuilt with fresh planks that smelled too clean for the Subura, which meant he had money from somewhere else. And she noted the way he stared at her from beneath heavy brows. His lips parted slightly as if about to speak, and the hunger in his gaze was not just physical but wrapped in something darker, something resentful, something lonely, something familiar. But she kept walking, letting his eyes follow the sway of her robe until the crowd swallowed her again, and all the while the city roared and murmured and chattered around her, its voice a thousand overlapping conversations. Bargains, curses, greetings, and lies, all spoken with the same casual cadence that gave Rome its breathless rhythm, a rhythm she had learned not to resist but echo, becoming just one more thread in the tapestry of need and transaction and motion. Every so often, she paused to inspect a basket of dried herbs or to finger the edge of a tunic dyed a faded green, not because she intended to buy, but because pausing gave others permission to look, and in those still moments, she could feel the eyes that lingered, feel the weight of glances sliding down her back or drifting across her collarbone, and though none would approach her here, not in daylight, not in the market, the seeds were being sown with every glance, every heartbeat, every blink. And she knew from long practice that some of these seeds would bloom by evening, perhaps in the form of a man who came to her door with awkward words and too many apologies, or perhaps only as a rumor that she was still worth visiting, still present, still pleasing, still young enough to matter in a city where age crept faster than the sun across the sky. And so she lingered, not long, just enough, her hands folded at her waist and her chin lifted slightly. And though her eyes never lingered too long on any one man, they swept the market slowly like a cool breeze, noting who looked away, and who pretended not to look but failed to hide the tension in their necks or the shift in their feet. These small things told her more than words, and it was in the silence between those glances that she built her living, not in the acts that followed, but in the unspoken contracts written in hesitation and need. At last, when the sun rose high enough to bring heat from the stones beneath her feet and the market began to stink of ripe cheese and overripe fruit, she moved on, her pace unchanged, her expression as unreadable as ever. But inside her mind, she carried a new map, a list of faces and names, some remembered, some guessed, all potential, all possible, and with each step, she grew more certain of how her evening might unfold, or who might need her warmth not because she was beautiful or clever or kind, but because in Rome, the body was a currency, and she had learned how to spend hers wisely. The walk back to her room was slower than the walk away, not because the way of the market had tired her, though it had, but because the sun had climbed higher now, and the stones beneath her feet radiated a heat that seeped through her sandals and into the bones of her legs, making each step feel like a negotiation between her body and the city itself, which in midday transformed from a stage of performance into something more punishing, a place of blistering walls, blinding light, and the hum of 1,000 insects hiding in cracks and shadows. Lucilia did not shield her eyes or quicken her pace, for to do so would be to admit discomfort, and discomfort, she had learned, was always an invitation to be observed more closely than was safe. Instead, she walked with her shoulders square and her gaze fixed just ahead, weaving through the narrower lanes with the ease of someone who had memorized the precise timings of shade throughout the district, which doorways offered relief, which overhangs dripped warm water from laundry lines above, which corners smelled more like rotting fruit than sewage, and which turns might spare her a confrontation with a familiar face whose attention she did not welcome at this hour. By the time she reached the stairwell of her tenement, the hem of her robe was dusted with yellow grit, and her lower back ached from the tightness of walking upright beneath a heat that clung like wet wool. And as she stepped back inside the shaded corridor, she felt a single breath escape her lips, not a sigh, but something quieter, the kind of exhalation one makes only in the privacy of shadows, the release of being unseen. The climb to her room was as it always was, each stair wore at the center and echoing with the sound of her movement, her fingers trailing along the peeling plaster of the wall, a ritual as unconscious as breathing. And when she reached her door and stepped inside, she felt the familiar dimness swallow her, the way a cocoon might, wrap itself around a sleeping creature, and for a long moment she did not move, did not undress, did not lie down, but merely stood in a half-light, listening to the silence that filled her space like water in a vessel. Eventually, her hands moved to loosen the fold of her robe, and she let it slip from her shoulders, pulling at her feet like the discarded skin of another self. And she stepped out of it and into the center of the room where the breeze from the small, high window did little, more than stir the edges of her hair. She sat on the edge of her cot, one foot tucked beneath her, the other flat against the floor, and she closed her eyes, not to sleep, not yet, but to remember, because rest did not come easily to her anymore unless it was layered with thought. And so she let her mind drift backwards through the years, sorting through the many faces that had passed across her life. Clients, yes, but also shadows, voices, gestures, the way some men avoided eye contact after, paying, the way others clung too tightly or spoke too softly, as if they were asking forgiveness without saying what they had done. She remembered the first man who had paid her, how his hands had trembled, and how hers had too, though she pretended otherwise. And she remembered the soldier who returned to her for 6 nights, and then disappeared without a word, leaving behind only the scent of oil on her blanket, and the merchant who insisted she sing to him after each visit, a lullaby he claimed his mother used to hum when he was sick, and the way his eyes looked afterward, not grateful, not aroused, but hollow, as if he had swallowed some part of himself he could no longer taste. And as she lay back now, resting her head on a folded tunic that served as a pillow, she felt the ache of those memories settle into her like a second spine, a structure made not of bone but of names and touches and unfinished conversations. And she let them weigh her down for a while, not fighting the heaviness, but allowing it to wrap around her as she drifted in and out of shallow sleep, never fully unconscious, always half listening to the sounds beyond her door, a child crying in the alley, a dog barking, a cart rumbling past, the faint ring of a smith's hammer, all of it reminding her that the day was moving forward with or without her, and that soon she would have to rise again, to prepare her body and her space and her mind for the hours ahead, the evening that always came with the same slow promise, that someone would knock, that someone would need her, that someone would pay not just for her presence, but for the careful illusion she had mastered, the performance of desire, the tenderness without entanglement, the borrowed comfort of skin against skin in a world that rarely gave warmth without price. And though she did not know yet who it would be, which of the morning's glances would turn into a request, which hesitation would harden into intent, she knew the process, knew the rhythm. And so she let her eyes remain closed a while longer, her body still, her breath slow, preserving the last fragile layer of quiet before the mask would go on again, and the evening would begin. The knock, when it came, was not loud, not urgent, not even particularly rhythmic, just 3 soft taps against the wooden frame of her door, like a question hesitating before it was fully formed. And Lucilia did not startle, did not call out, did not ask who it was, because the pattern was familiar, and so was the hour. And in her line of work, names were a courtesy, not a necessity. She moved to the door with the same steady pace she had used all evening, untied the leather strap that held. The latch closed, and opened it just far enough to see the man waiting there, his face half in shadow, his shoulders hunched slightly as if shielding himself from a wind that did not exist, though the night was warm and still. He was not young, not old. Somewhere in that quiet space between decline and desperation, his tunic well-made but wrinkled, his sandals dusty from the street, and in his hand he held a small pouch of coins already drawn from his belt, offering it forward not with reverence or shame, but with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this before and would do it again. And Lucilia took it without a word, her fingers brushing it for the briefest moment before she stepped aside to let him enter, her movements fluid and practiced, her face calm and unreadable, as though she had already stepped out herself and into the role expected of her. The man crossed the threshold slowly, not like someone afraid, but like someone heavy with his own thoughts. And as he entered, the scent of his cologne, something musky, imported, clinging like wine-soaked linen, filled the narrow room, mingling with the softer perfume of rose oil she had applied earlier, creating an aroma that seemed both intimate and distant, like a memory that lingered just out of reach. He did not speak as he sat on the edge of her cot, nor did she prompt him, for she knew that silence was often more comfortable than conversation, and this man, in particular, had never been one for words, not in greeting, not in parting, not even during the act itself, which had always struck her as less about pleasure than about necessity, as if he were trying to outrun something only he could see and had chosen her bed as a temporary hiding place. Lucilia moved to the basin, poured a bit of water into her hands, rubbed her palms together slowly, and wiped them dry on a cloth, not because she needed to cleanse herself, but because the gesture gave her something to do, a way to occupy the moment without filling it. And when she turned back, he was already lying down, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, his arms folded across his chest, as if bracing against some unspoken weight, and she sat beside him, not touching him yet, waiting for the small gesture, the shift of his hand, the tilt of his head, that would signal readiness, that would permit the next motion. It came, eventually, a slow unfurling of his fingers against the linen, and she moved with equal slowness, lying beside him with the careful precision of someone placing themselves into a painting rather than a bed, her body curving alongside his, her hand resting gently on his arm, not with affection, but with permission, and as they lay there in the soft glow of the single oil lamp, the silence grew not heavier but softer, like a blanket drawn over a restless child. And for a time, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, neither of them sought anything beyond the nearness of flesh and the fading. Light, the act, when it happened, was quick, almost forgettable, a muted exchange that did not disrupt the stillness of the room or the rhythm of night. And when it was over, he did not linger, did not ask for words or water or reassurance, but simply sat up, adjusted his tunic, and stood, glancing once toward the window as if expecting to see something beyond it, perhaps the answer to the thing that had driven him here. And then, without looking back, he left the soft scuff of his sandals fading down the stairs and into the night like a sentence left unfinished. Lucilia closed the door gently, latched it again, and turned to the space he had occupied, now marked only by the faint indentation on the cot and the scent of his cologne hanging in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished. And she did not sit down, did not wash her hands, did not straighten the blanket just yet, but stood for a moment in the hush that followed his departure, listening to the city outside, now deeper in its nocturnal hum, and wondered, not for the first time, if the men who came to her sought her body, or merely the moment after, the stillness, the silence, the absence of judgment in a world that measured everything in coin and pride and failure. By the time the sun had fully risen and spilled its golden weight across the baked tiles and crooked alleyways, Lucilia had already greeted the new day not with hope or excitement, but with the resigned repetition of her weary routine. Morning in the Subura did not unfold with softness or serenity. It staggered into life with a loud bartering of vendors, the sharp clatter of hooves on stone, and the thick scent of heat settling into rotting produce and stale wine. From a narrow window of her chamber, where a reed mat flapped loosely in the breeze, She watched the layers of Roman life peel themselves awake. Slaves shuffling under heavy amphory, bakers scraping yesterday's soot from their ovens, barbers setting out mirrors on their wooden stalls. All of it buzzed below her, unconcerned with the hidden sorrows that lived behind the walls above. For Lucilia, the morning was not a chance to reset. It was a slow return to the burdens she could not set down. She crossed the room barefoot, each step soft against the worn clay floor, and unlatched the small wooden chest that held her most important possessions. Not jewelry or perfume, though a single tiny vial of thick, musky oil did rattle in the corner, but rather things like a folded piece of linen, a half-eaten barley cake, a faded ribbon once tied in her hair, and a dull bronze coin of uncertain value. From beneath a strip of cloth she pulled a crude brush, its bristles stiff with old oil, and slowly began to draw it through her dark hair. It was not vanity that guided her hand, nor any hope of admiration, but habit, ritual, perhaps, a form of order in a life where dignity had long ago been bartered away. Her eyes remained unfocused as she worked, staring at the cracked plaster on the wall before her, where someone, perhaps herself years ago, had scratched the faint outline of a bird in flight. There was no mirror, of course. Few in her position could afford such things, and fewer still would find comfort in their own reflection. Lucilia dressed with the same care she afforded her hair, smoothing her stolen girdle, adjusting the folds so they would sit just so. Today she would wear the ochre-colored wrap, not the red one. Red drew too much attention on days when her body still ached from the night before. She wrapped the fabric around her shoulders, noting with dull irony that it matched the color Roman law required of prostitutes. The toga muliebris, a garment that separated women like her from the modest matrons who drifted by in layers of white and blue. It was a badge of her shame, visible to any magistrate, soldier, or curious citizen who passed her in the street. She had long ago ceased to resent it. Resentment, like hope, was a luxury not easily sustained in her world. Downstairs, the day began in earnest. The housekeeper, an older woman named Vibia who bore the brutal face of someone who had seen too many of these houses, barked orders at one of the younger girls for leaving the courtyard door unlatched. The clatter of buckets at the fountain echoed against the inner walls as they hauled in fresh water for washing. Lucilia knew she would be expected to help clean later, to scrub the tiles near the latrine or empty the ash pan from the brazier. There were no exceptions, not even for the older girls. Especially not for the older girls. Her joints stiffened as she stepped carefully down the worn stairs into the central atrium, where a shaft of light spilled from the oculus above and made the dust glitter in the air like gold. Outside, the Subura had come alive in all its chaotic fullness. Chickens scratched at the gutters. The meat seller hacked ribs with rhythmic precision. Children shrieked in play as they darted between market stalls. It was a world bursting with movement and color and sound, and yet, somehow, Lucilia always moved through it as if submerged beneath water. The conversations around her were muffled. The laughter of others passed through her, never quite reaching the parts of her where warmth might bloom. She passed a man selling dates from a woven basket and thought briefly of the first time she had tasted one. How sweet it seemed, how exotic. Now they tasted only of sugar and dust. She stopped at a small corner apothecary, a shadowy nook run by a man with crooked fingers who said little and asked less. He handed her a wrapped bundle of dried herbs and a tiny clay pot of thick paste. For the soreness, he muttered without meeting her eyes. She paid with a coin she kept hidden in her sandal. It would mean skipping lunch, but the pain in her thighs and lower back would not wait until evening. She tucked the items into her wrap and made her way back toward the house, each footstep slow and deliberate. Every part of her moved as if she were older than her years, as if her body carried not just her weight, but the weight of all the hands that touched it, all the voices that called her name in the dark, all the silence that had followed after. Back inside, the rooms were hotter than they had been outside. The stones drank in the sunlight and held it close like some cruel joke. Lucilia paused beneath the arched doorway of the triclinium, where two of the other girls were already lounging, talking in low voices. One of them offered her a nod. The other didn't look up. They weren't cruel, not exactly, but in a place like this, kindness was rationed like wine. Too much and you ran out. Too little and you forgot what it tasted like. Lucilia moved past them into the far room, where she carefully laid the bundle from the apothecary beneath her straw mattress and sat down beside it, the rushes crackling under her weight. Outside the walls, Rome thundered on, its chariots rolling, its vendors shouting, its temples glowing in the distance. But here, in this quiet hour between the end of the morning and the beginning of the day's true labor, Lucilia sat in a heavy stillness, hands resting on her knees, staring once again at nothing in particular. There was no clock to tick down the hours, no bell to announce a shift from morning to afternoon, and yet her body knew, her bones knew. Soon the housekeeper would call. Soon it would be time to bathe again, to oil the skin, to dress once more for men who would not care if she was sore or tired or hollow. But for now, there was a breath of stillness, a moment between the pages of her life. And in that moment, Lucilia did not weep, nor did she smile. She simply existed. And then, as if summoned by thought alone, the faint sound of water pouring echoed to the narrow hall, and the bathing basin began to fill, signaling that the preparations for midday were beginning once more. The midday heat pressed down like a hand too large of sky, flattening every rooftop and curling the corners of the awnings that drooped over tavern doors and shop fronts. The Subura, already dense with life, now simmered in a haze of dust and sun, its stone streets shimmering faintly under the weight of noon. Inside the dim, stuffy brothel, the air was thick with a stale mixture of perfumed oils and sweat, mingled with the acrid traces of last night's spilled wine and the faint, persistent trace of mildew creeping along the woodwork. Lucilia had retreated to the back room, her eyes strained from the relentless light that filtered into the broken shutter, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, and her mind cloudy from too little food and too many early demands. She lay on a straw mat that itched her skin, the fabric of her tunic clinging unpleasantly to her body, still damp from the morning's labors. It was not rest she sought in that moment, for rest was seldom available, but simply stillness, a moment where no one asked, touched, stared, bargained, or whispered. The walls of the room were the color of old wax, stained and peeling in places, bearing the faint outline of faded murals, a dancing faun, a reclining Venus, a long crumbled god offering a garland of flowers. They had once been painted to entice, to distract from the poverty of the setting, to promise some imagined luxury that never truly existed. Now, they were silent witnesses to time and transaction, their once bright pigments dulled by years of smoke and skin. Lucilia studied them often in moments like these, tried to trace the faded lines back to what they might have looked like before the weight of years and bodies blurred them into ghostly outlines. She found a strange comfort in their erosion, as if even beauty in Rome was made to rot, just like everything else. Outside, voices rose and fell, vendors crying out the prices of bread and olives, the slap of sandals against stone, the squealing wheels of a vegetable cart turning a tight corner. Sometimes, if she focused hard enough, she could imagine she was part of that world. The midday Roman bustle, loud and sunlit, full of direction and honest sweat. She pictured herself walking among them, a folded basket on her hip, choosing fruit with slow care, laughing with a market woman over the price of lentils. She would be someone else then, not Lucilia the Lupa, not the nameless girl behind the curtain, just another face among the many. But the smell of her own body, still tainted by other people's closeness, brought her back each time, a sharp reminder that her place was behind walls, not in the crowd. Her midday meal was the same as it had been for weeks, if there was any at all. Today, she had scrounged a crust of coarse barley bread left behind by a hurried client, softened in a cup of cheap watered wine. She chewed slowly, not for taste, but to trick her stomach into feeling satisfied. Hunger was a regular companion, as persistent as shame and far less complicated. The men who paid didn't expect her to be well fed. In truth, some preferred her gaunt, the sharpness of her collarbones, the hollow curve of her waist, evidence that she needed their coin, that she would not say no. Some liked desperation. Others were simply indifferent to the condition of the bodies they purchased, as long as they were still warm. As the day lengthened and the sun began to dip ever so slightly towards decline, the light in the brothel softened, casting the peeling murals in long, golden streaks. A fly buzzed persistently at the edge of the shutter. Somewhere, far off, a child called out and a dog barked in reply. These were the hours in which Lucilia sometimes dreamed, Not true dreams, not sleep-drenched wanderings, but quiet wanderings of the mind. She would imagine herself older, away from Rome, perhaps in a village near the coast, where olive trees rolled over the hills like waves. She pictured herself sitting on a wall with the wind in her hair and no name on her lips, no price on her body, no stares, no groping hands, no coins dropped like curses. But the fantasy always dissolved when footsteps echoed in the hall again. Heavy sandals, confident stride, someone else returning from lunch, from wine, from whatever work or leisure the city offered. And she knew, without looking, that the moment of stillness had ended, that the next knock, the next drawn curtain, would summon her back into the role the city had carved for her, one she had never chosen. The stillness of midday was a borrowed thing, like a stolen cloak that never quite fit, and even that, she knew, would soon be taken back. So she rose from the mat, brushed crumbs from her lap, and straightened her tunic as best she could. The softness of afternoon was ending. Evening clients would come with different hungers, and the lanterns would be lit once more. As the day drifted onward and the sun sat high above the rooftops, baking every tile and plaster wall, Lucilia found herself walking slowly through the shade of the Bernie again, her sandals scratching quietly against the uneven stones. There was no urgent purpose to her wandering, for this part of the day was often quiet, and in that lull, she preferred to remain visible yet detached, just a presence among the crowd. Some of the other women would rest during this hour, lying languidly on benches or reclining against stone, but Lucilia chose motion, a slow, graceful motion that kept her from being pulled too far into the fatigue of stillness. As she passed small gatherings of men playing dice, old women carrying bundles, and children sweeping doorways, she noticed how many eyes glanced toward her and then away again. In Rome, everything was watched and judged, yet almost nothing was said aloud. The Romans did not speak openly of what they desired. That was a thing kept behind eyes, behind the careful modulation of voice, the shifted chin, the pause of a sentence. Lucilia had become an expert in this language, one that was never taught, but was learned over years through countless failed readings and painful miscalculations. She could sense intent in a half-second too long gaze, or in the awkward moment someone pretended not to notice her. Every glance was a gamble, every smile a disguise. The brothel trained her to decode these micro-expressions, for clients rarely entered boldly. They circled first. They hesitated. They tested the waters with looks and double meanings. So as she stood outside the leatherworker's shop, appearing as though she was merely watching a stray dog gnawing at a strap, she was in truth scanning faces. Faces that passed her by with varying degrees of interest, discomfort, or contempt. Some men did not look at her at all, and their disinterest was genuine. Others made a point of pretending not to look, which always meant they were very much aware. A few allowed their eyes to rest a moment too long, and these were the ones she mentally filed away. Not necessarily as clients, but as men she might see again. Rome was large, but not vast. Paths crossed often. There was one older senator she had noticed on 3 occasions, always late in the afternoon, always near the same vegetable stall. He never spoke, never stopped, but always slowed as he passed. His eyes never met hers directly, but flickered toward her sandals, her arm, her shoulder. She knew this pattern well. Perhaps one day he would approach, or perhaps not, but it did not matter. In Lucilia's world, men were not needed to be actual clients to be measured. Every man was a potential risk or advantage. Every glance was data, and women like her survived by cataloging this unspoken economy. A young boy came running past, chased by a slightly older brother, both laughing, carrying a crust of bread between them like it was treasure. Lucilia watched them disappear into the crowd, and wondered if they, too, would grow up learning how to look without looking, how to speak with eyes instead of words. It was not just a trait of her trade. It was a Roman condition. The Republic had long since vanished, but its habits lingered: suspicion, calculation, performance. In such a city, sincerity was considered naive, and silence was safer than truth. Back in the small brothel where she would eventually return, this knowledge became vital. When a client stepped through the door, his first words rarely mattered. What mattered was the way he crossed the threshold. Was it hesitant? Bold? Did he avert his gaze? Or did he stare too long? The madam taught her to listen with her eyes, and Lucilia had long since surpassed her. Her skill had grown until she could even sense what a man feared most: exposure, weakness, rejection. Some men paid for the illusion of dominance. Others, the illusion of being desired. And all of this was known in silence, through glances, sighs, and the subtle choreography of approach. As the shadows began to lengthen and the heat of the afternoon dipped into a drowsy haze, Lucilia leaned against the cool wall of the tavern and let her mind drift. She did not consider herself clever, nor did she believe she had been especially gifted in reading people. It had merely been necessity. In Rome, survival was its own education, and those who did not learn were swallowed whole by the city's indifferent churn. She had been swallowed once, long ago, when she first arrived with nothing but borrowed clothes and a bruised ankle. But she had learned. She had learned the language no one spoke aloud. And so she stood in the street, her eyes half-lidded, her posture relaxed, and all the while she read the city around her. Not just its people, but its mood, its rhythm, its invisible pulses. Rome hummed with a language beneath words, and Lucilia, quiet and alert, listened with all the weariness of someone who had no choice but to understand. The afternoon air grew heavier, and the room once again became stifling. The sun, nearing its highest point, filtered through the warped shutters and bathed the walls in wavering strips of gold and dust. Lucilia remained still for some time after her last client had left, the scent of stale perfume, wine, and worn linen clinging to her skin. She stared at the cracks in the ceiling, their branching paths familiar to her now, like the wrinkles of a city that never changed. Below, in the alley, life pressed on, merchants shouted, donkeys brayed, and the hum of Roman life buzzed just beyond her fragile window. But inside, everything felt sealed, muted, disconnected from the bustle of the world outside. Her body ached, not just from the work of the day, but from the weight of repetition, the knowledge that nothing tomorrow would be any different than today, and that today had offered no surprises from yesterday. Time in this profession did not move forward in a line, but circled itself, a wheel turning with the same dull rhythm day after day. Her joints cracked as she sat up and moved the stool by the small table where a chipped bowl of yesterday's lentils sat. She ate in silence, slowly, thoughtfully, not because she was savoring the taste. There was little taste left in food bought cheap and left uncovered, but because chewing gave her something to focus on other than the hollowness gnawing her chest. As she finished, a knock came at the door. Not a client, not yet, but her neighbor Flavia, who shared the room across the landing. She was older, sharper, her face set in a mask of bitter humor, and the two shared a kind of unspoken camaraderie. They did not speak often, but their silences were full of mutual recognition, the kind that only women in similar positions understood. Flavia offered a jug of watered wine, and Lucilia accepted with a nod. Together, they sat by the window for a while, listening to the street, saying nothing, just two women fading into the long hours of another Roman afternoon, waiting for the sun to fall low enough that the world would demand something more of them again. The day was not yet done, but the golden haze that now slanted through the shutters began to stretch longer across the dusty floorboards, casting shadows that seemed to yawn lazily across the walls, as if they too were preparing themselves for the return of the night. Lucilia remained seated, the cup of watered wine warming slightly in her hand, untouched for the moment, as her thoughts drifted slowly like the thin clouds crawling across the late afternoon sky above the city. The weight of silence pressing again, not oppressive, but enveloping, like a warm cloak gently draped over shoulders grown weary. Flavia had gone back to her room, leaving Lucilia to her solitude once more, the shared jug now sitting between them like a quiet promise that neither woman truly needed to speak aloud to understand. From her place by the window, Lucilia could just barely make out the distant clatter of carts bumping over uneven stones and the clamor of vendors beginning to pack away their stalls. The city was shifting again, entering that brief, uncertain twilight period when the labor of the day began to recede, but before the darkness fully claimed the streets. It was a transition Lucilia knew intimately. For her, it marked not rest, but a different kind of readiness. This in-between time was delicate, a curtain drawn only half closed, when the respectable citizens of the city returned to their homes, and another class of customer began to emerge, those who moved under cover of dusk, eyes darting in robes pulled a little tighter, men who avoided being seen in the daylight in places like hers, but who, as soon as the shadows stretched long enough, became bolder in their appetites. Lucilia rose with slow breath and set the cup down, pushing her fingers into her temples where a dull ache had begun to form. The room needed tending. The sheets would need changing, if not washed entirely, at least beaten out and straightened. The small brazier in the corner would be rekindled with a pinch of dried rosemary and a dab of oil to cleanse the air. She moved about the space with familiar, slow movements, each task more ritual than necessity. The room, bare as it was, required a kind of constant tending. Not for beauty, for there was little of that left in the cracked plaster and worn furnishings, but for readiness. Her clients expected a semblance of order, of cleanliness, even if the bed sagged and the scent of sweat and wine still lingered faintly beneath the perfume. She stripped the linen with practiced efficiency, folding them at sharp angles and laying fresh cloth across the mattress, smoothing the wrinkles with the flat of her hand. Her fingers were calloused from years of work, perhaps not from hard labor like those who toiled in the fields or carried water along the Inslee stairs, but from a different kind of endurance, a persistence that had shaped every part of her. She lit a small lamp and placed it on the windowsill, allowing its soft glow to mingle with the last of the sun's warmth. The ritual was nearly complete. She bathed her face and neck with water that had long since gone cool in its clay basin, then dabbed a touch of oil behind her ears, cheap but fragrant enough to mask what needed masking. As she leaned into the small mirror, its surface slightly warped, her own reflection looked back at her with the detached gaze of someone observing a role rather than a person. She painted a hint of rouge onto her cheeks, just enough to chase away the pallor of the day, and brushed a dull bronze comb through her dark hair, now slightly damp from sweat. In these moments, Lucilia became someone else. Not wholly, not truly, but enough to slide into the evening's role, like an old tunic. The act was not new. For many years now, she had performed this silent transformation, as fluid and instinctive as breathing. Outside, the streetlights, small braziers hung on iron hooks, began to glow one by one, their flames flickering gently as the wind wound through the narrow passages of the Sabura district. The sounds shifted too. The shouting of the fishmongers gave way to laughter from taverns. Doors opened onto alleyways, and the scent of spiced wine and roasted meat crept into the air. Lucilia knew which footsteps meant what. The heavy, confident strides of a soldier off duty, jangling with coins. The lighter, hesitant steps of a younger man, unsure of himself. The arrogant gait of a wealthy patron who spoke too loudly and laughed too easily to be truly at ease. She could sense them coming long before they ever reached her door. The city whispered to her through those footfalls, telling stories that no senator in the Forum would ever admit existed. Her first caller that evening was early, an older man, his tunic well worn but clean, a merchant perhaps, or a tradesman. He greeted her with a smile that was neither lewd nor kind, merely expected. He handed over 2 bronze coins and asked no questions. She knew what he wanted before he even opened his mouth. It was not passion or novelty. It was routine, something dependable, like a warm meal or a familiar song. Their time together passed quietly, uneventfully, and when he left, he did so without lingering. Lucilia sat again on the bed, smoothing the blanket beneath her fingers, staring into the floor's patternless grains. The evening went on like that. A pause, then another knock, another man, another mood, another rhythm to absorb. She adjusted herself with each visitor. More laughter here, more silence there. Sometimes a whisper, other times a firm hand on a shoulder. It was not about desire, not really. It was performance, comfort, repetition. There were moments, brief and unspoken, when some of them came not to take, but to feel taken care of. They lay beside her without speaking or held her hand, or simply asked her to listen as they rambled on about wives who did not understand them or jobs that drained them. Lucilia never judged. She did not need to. These moments paid just the same as the others and left her just as tired. Between callers, she washed again, reapplied her oil, adjusted the lamp. Her body moved as if detached from her thoughts, as though she existed on 2 planes. One physical, always preparing, always accommodating. The other drifting higher up, above the rooftops of Rome where no man's hand could reach. Sometimes she imagined herself flying, high over the city, above the temples and the crowded tenements, above the blood-stained sand of the Colosseum and the bathhouses and the markets. Up there, the city lost its noise, its heat, its hunger. Up there, Lucilia could be no one at all. And in that nothingness, she found a strange kind of peace. By the time the moon had risen fully and the torches outside burned low, her limbs had grown heavy again. She leaned against the wall, curling her knees beneath her and exhaling long and slow. A quiet settled over the room, thick and complete. The night was not over, not yet, but it paused here, held its breath, as if waiting for the city to exhale with her. And so she closed her eyes, just for a moment, and let herself float somewhere between the weight of her body and the ghosts of her thoughts, suspended in that soft gray space where the day's demands faded into the hush of night's embrace. As the day leaned further into its decline, the golden hues of the Roman sun began to melt into softer, more forgiving tones, casting the walls of Lucilia's room in a dusky warmth that somehow made everything feel momentarily gentler, even beautiful. The harsh white of midday had dulled into a quiet amber, like the fading of a once-sharp memory, and for a brief spell, the entire building seemed to sigh in unison. Lucilia sat still by the crooked window ledge, elbows resting on its uneven sill, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the faint scorch marks left by an old oil lamp accident months earlier. Outside, the rhythm of the city was shifting. Merchants no longer barked with the same fervor. Animals moved more sluggishly, and the clang of iron or the hammering of carts grew less frequent, replaced by the occasional burst of laughter from a passing group of tipsy drinkers or the melodic call of a street piper earning his coin near the public fountain. Flavia had left after finishing her diluted wine, offering nothing more than a knowing glance, the kind that said, "We'll meet this evening, when the lamps are lit and the masks go back on." The silence in the room that followed was thick but comforting, like a woolen shawl draped across weary shoulders. Lucilia let it settle over her for a while, letting the shadows climb the corners of the room, watching the day slowly undress itself. Her mind drifted, not in sharp leaps, but in slow, meandering steps, to memories that came without invitation. The sound of her mother's voice singing softly while kneading dough, the feeling of wet grass beneath her feet as a child running down a village slope, the first time she saw the city's aqueducts rising like colossal ribs against the sky, and how small she had felt beneath them. Those memories didn't visit often anymore, and when they did, they came softly, blurred around the edges like a dream. But such moments could not last forever in a life ruled by necessity. As twilight approached, so too did the reality of her occupation begin to tighten its grip. The scent of oil began to waft through the walls. Neighbors lighting their lamps, brushing out their hair, applying perfumes and powders, each ritual a transformation. Lucilia rose from the stool with a sigh that came from deep within her chest. She washed her face with cool water from the basin, then reapplied a faint tint to her cheeks using the last of her rouge, mixed carefully with crushed mulberries and a bit of leftover chalk to make it stretch. Her hair, which had come undone from its braid during the heat of the day, was gathered and pinned with care, though not with vanity but precision. These gestures weren't about allure so much as survival. Looking appealing ensured more visitors. More visitors meant more denarii, and more denarii meant a little more security, a little less fear of hunger, and perhaps even occasional indulgence, like a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, or a new pair of sandals once every few months. By the time the first oil lamp was lit in the hallway and the flickering orange glow danced across the cracked wall of her room, Lucilia had finished preparing. She changed into garments she reserved for evenings, not particularly fine, but cleaner, softer, with a deep red sash that contrasted nicely with her dark hair. It wasn't silk or linen from Alexandria, of course. Those belonged to the courtesans of the elite, the ones who reclined beside senators and poets in perfumed gardens. Lucilia's world was a simpler cloth, of patched hems and faded dyes, but even so, she wore it like armor when she stepped into the common hallway. The familiar creaks of the boards beneath her sandals reminded her how often she had made this walk. The hallway smelled of perfume, wax, and sweat, a strange mix that had become almost invisible to her over time. Doors stood slightly ajar, the flicker of lamplight within casting long slivers of life into the corridor. Somewhere, someone was laughing too loudly, probably drunk already. Somewhere else, a woman cursed under her breath, trying to hide a black eye beneath layers of powder. Lucilia made her way downstairs with a madam, an aging woman named Marcia with sharp eyes and a limp, sat at her usual post, a clay tablet resting in her lap, and a reed stylus in hand. She glanced at Lucilia without warmth but with recognition, and made a small mark on the wax surface. Each girl had to check in, to ensure order and record who worked when and for how long. It was all part of the business, and Lucilia respected it. There was safety and structure, even in such a place. Outside the door, the street hummed with the early sounds of nightlife. Drunken footsteps echoed off cobblestones, and laughter mingled with flute music in the distance. The air smelled of grilled fish, cheap wine, and the smoke of burning pine branches from street vendors keeping their hands warm. Lucilia stepped out not with hesitation, but with practiced calm. Her destination was not far, a nearby papina, a kind of Roman tavern, where men from all classes came to drink, gamble, argue, and seek comfort in flesh. The path was familiar, the faces on the route even more so. She passed the fruit vendor who always made lewd comments, the group of boys who mocked the women from the shadows, the beggar with the milky eyes who always asked for coins and never remembered faces. As she walked, she adjusted her posture, let her eyes soften, let her lips curl into a half smile, not genuine but effective. It was all part of transformation, the gentle slipping into another version of herself, one built not from childhood dreams or desires, but from the demands of survival. The papina was already buzzing when she arrived. Torches lit the walls with dancing flames, and the clatter of dice, cups, and sandals filled the narrow space. She was greeted by the barkeeper, a squat man with a missing tooth and a permanent scowl, who nodded toward the back corner, where the wealthier patrons tended to sit. These men came from all walks of life. Retired soldiers flush with their pensions, tradesmen closing early, scribes looking to forget the day's monotony. Lucilia moved among them like a shadow, knowing when to laugh, when to touch a shoulder, when to pour wine with deliberate slowness. The conversations she overheard were often absurd. Boasts of battles never fought, exaggerations of wealth, rumors about politics and gods. But she smiled, listened, and let them speak, because listening was often the most valuable service of all. And as the evening deepened, as the wine flowed more freely and the songs turned bawdier, Lucilia remained a steady presence, her voice low and calm, her movements unhurried. She would leave with one of them soon, or perhaps two, depending on the mood and the price. But for now, she was still in control, still floating in the fragile in-between space of dusk, where the day had ended but the night had not yet fully claimed her. As the last dregs of sunlight slipped beyond the rooftops and the Roman sky dimmed from a hazy amber of late afternoon into the bruised hues of twilight, the city began to exhale a different kind of breath, one filled with softer footfalls, cloaked intentions, and the gentle slosh of wine in clay cups passed between quiet hands. Evening in Rome did not descend with silence, but with transformation, and Lucilia, seated again on the edge of her thin mattress, knew the time had come to prepare. Not just her room, not just her hair or her clothing, but her face, her tone, her very being. The day had demanded endurance. The night would require illusion. She reached for the bronze mirror, a piece she had owned since her earliest days in the city. Its surface, once polished to a fine gleam, was now dull and dented, barely offering a full reflection, as if even the mirror had grown tired of revealing the same face, night after night, year after year. Still it was enough. She tilted it toward the fading light from the window and leaned forward, examining the lines beneath her eyes, the slight redness in the whites, the sheen of sweat that clung to her brow. From a wooden box, she retrieved the few tools she had to mask these details. A small pot of powdered chalk to pale the skin, a bit of crushed cinnabar for the lips, and a cake of blackened ash used to darken the lashes and brows. These simple applications, applied slowly and without ceremony, were not meant for beauty. They were part of a ritual, a transformation that allowed her to step into a version of herself she did not recognize, but had come to rely on. This was not vanity. It was armor. It allowed Lucilia to blur the edges between herself and the persona the night demanded. Beneath the streak of rouge and the coal-lined eyes, she could become someone else entirely. Someone who didn't flinch when a man spoke roughly, Someone who didn't shrink when a hand reached too quickly. Someone who smiled, even when her spirit begged her not to. She tied her hair loosely with a strip of dyed wool, letting it fall in calculated waves that would appear effortless to the untrained eye. She wrapped herself in a deep red stola, one that clung to her curves but still offered a whisper of modesty, the kind that allowed a man to believe he was the first to see what was beneath it. She lit the oil lamp near the door, its flickering glow casting soft shadows across the room, transforming the cracks in the plaster into gentle lines, the worn furniture into shapes that no longer seemed so shabby. The scent of the oil mingled with a sprig of rosemary she burned beside it. Not enough to mask the mustiness entirely, but enough to suggest a hint of care, of warmth, of hospitality. Her room, small and sparse though it was, needed to become a space that felt removed from the chaos outside. The illusion of comfort, of intimacy, was part of what her visitors paid for. They were not here only for the body, though that was the anchor. They sought escape. They brought with them burdens of their own, disappointments in marriage, humiliations at the forum, rejections from a patron, or simply the dull ache of a life without joy. Lucilia knew their stories even before they told them. They all blurred together, these Roman men, wealthy merchants, minor senators, former soldiers, foreign tradesmen, all of them wearing different faces but carrying the same hunger, not just for pleasure, but for being seen. And in her presence, under the cover of night and secrecy, many believed they were. She knew how to listen without reacting, how to murmur a phrase at the right moment, how to touch a forearm or lean in close with a glance that seemed to say, "You are understood." It was not love. It was not even affection, but it was a performance of intimacy, and in that performance there was power. Still, as she sat waiting for the knock at the door, the minutes stretching longer than usual, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, the kind that crept in like a ghost, uninvited but oddly comforting. She leaned back, her head resting against the crumbling wall, and looked again toward the darkening sky. The stars had begun to blink into view, pale pinpricks in the purpling dome above. Somewhere, far beyond the slums and stone roads, the Tiber flowed gently, and in the distance, faint music wafted up from a wealthier quarter, a flute perhaps, or a lyre, strummed lightly by a hand that had never known labor. She wondered, briefly, what it would be like to walk along that river bank with no fear, no eyes watching her, as though she were a meal to be consumed. She wondered what it would feel like to be a woman whose time was her own, whose body was untouched by coin, whose name was spoken with tenderness and not transaction. These thoughts came and went, like ripples across a still pond, disturbing the surface but never reaching the depths. At last, the knock came, not sharp, not hesitant, but measured, practiced. She rose and crossed the room slowly, gathering the part of herself that would receive him. The door creaked open to reveal a man in his 30s, clean-shaven, well-groomed, wearing a tunic dyed just rich enough to suggest success, but not so boldly as to imply arrogance. He nodded, and she stepped aside. Words were exchanged only briefly. His name, a compliment on her room, a question about the wine, and then the transaction unfolded as it always did, smoothly, predictably. He sat on the stool. She poured the wine. He spoke about his day, about a miscalculation in the market, a client who had grown angry. She listened when his hand brushed hers. She did not flinch. When he leaned closer, she tilted her head just so, and when the moment came for them to disappear into the ritual they both knew by heart, she did not think. She acted. She became the woman he needed her to be. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Survive, endure, rest will come later." The night pressed on, the room growing warmer with every passing moment. Outside, the city buzzed in the ways it always had, oblivious of the private worlds contained in small rooms like hers. But for Lucilia, every touch, every sigh, every whisper was part of a delicate negotiation, not of passion, not even a payment, but presence. And as the lamp flickered lower and the wine drained from the cup, she let herself vanish again into the mask, the role, the act that kept her alive another night longer. Evening in the Suburra settled slowly, like a heavy fabric drawn gently across the sky, deepening the shadows that clung to the base of every wall, every crumbling column, every crooked alleyway that slithered behind the proud facades of Rome's grandeur. The once golden light of the afternoon dulled into a weary amber and eventually softened into shades of deep rust and gray, and Lucilia watched the transition unfold through her window. Seated beside the same wooden sill where she had sat with Flavia earlier that day, her thoughts quiet and her limbs stilled by the sheer weight of exhaustion. The birds that had once chirped with insistence now quieted, replaced by the slow, stammering clatter of sandals against cobblestone as men returned from the baths or from their work, stopping only to haggle with vendors or bark a final order at their household slaves. From her perch, Lucilia could see the faint flicker of torches being lit down the avenue, one by one, like little trembling stars, each one dancing briefly in protest against the coming night, trying to hold the dark at bay for just a few more moments, though they never succeeded for long. In her room, shadows bled across the floor in soft ribbons, curling over the straw mattress and stretching up the cracked wall like creeping vines, and Lucilia, still in her linen wrap, barely noticed them. She had been quiet for what felt like hours, staring down at her hands, the same hands that had once belonged to a girl who picked figs in the countryside, who had once braided her sister's hair and laughed at the gossip of village boys. These hands had now become something different, something that no longer belonged entirely to her. They had been held, kissed, grasped, pulled, paid for. They had been offered like a promise, and used like a tool. She turned them over slowly, fingers extended, as though trying to read a future from the lines on her palms. But the only story they told was of wear and repetition, of endless sameness wrapped in scented oils and dim candlelight. Below, the night world was beginning to wake. The taverns on the corner began their low thrum of music and drunken argument, the soft plucking of a lyre and the heavier sounds of laughter that had yet to sour into violence. A passing cart rattled by, its driver half singing a mournful tune about a soldier who had lost his lover to a wine cellar in Capua. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then stopped. Somewhere else, a child cried and was hushed. Rome was not a quiet city, not even in sleep. But for women like Lucilia, the coming of night was not an invitation to rest, but a call to arms, though the weapons were painted lips and supple hips, and the battlefield was a narrow room that reeked of spiced oil and wine-soaked breath. There was a ritual to it, this part of her day, a procession of preparation that had become as mechanical as any temple ceremony, though no gods waited at the end of it. She rose with a sigh and reached for the bronze mirror near the table, the polished surface warped and cloudy from years of use, but familiar nonetheless. She lit a small clay lamp, the flame stuttering at first before blooming into a steady glow, casting warm yellow light across her features. She studied herself, her face, thinner than it had been last season, her eyes, still lined with kohl from the previous evening, her mouth, chapped at the corners. Her hair, coiled tightly at the nape of her neck, had come loose in strands, and she began to fix it with practiced care, winding into a shape that looked effortless but had taken months to perfect. Next came the perfumes. She uncorked a small glass vial filled with myrrh and saffron, imported, expensive, and used sparingly. She dabbed it behind her ears, on her wrists, at the base of her throat. It masked the scent of sweat, of tiredness, of Rome's many odors that clung to every surface and every soul. Then the cosmetics, a dab of red powder for her cheeks, a dark line around the eyes to make them seem larger, more inviting, more mysterious. She applied each layer with the same dispassionate care as a soldier polishing armor, for that was what it was, armor for the coming hours, for the men who would knock and laugh and stagger in, expecting softness, fantasy, obedience. She changed into her second tunic, a thinner, more revealing one that fell loosely off her shoulders and hinted at the curves beneath. It was not elegant, but it was effective. In the mirror, she no longer looked like Lucilia, the girl who once ran barefoot through the vineyards. She looked like Lucilia, the woman men sought in hushed tones and fleeting glances, the woman whose name they sometimes whispered but more often forgot the moment they left. She drew in a breath and held it, then let it out slowly, and just as she finished her preparations, there came the knock, not loud, not rushed, but soft and rhythmic, the kind that suggested the man on the other side had done this many times before. She opened the door without a word, and there he stood, middle-aged, red-faced, smelling faintly of wine and too much sun, his eyes glassy, but not cruel. He handed her a coin, more than she expected, which meant he either had a guilty conscience or wanted something unusual, and she stepped aside to let him in. She didn't ask his name. He didn't ask hers. They never did. The room became, for a moment, a stage, and she became a role, not a person. She smiled. She tilted her head. She moved with slow, calculated grace. He spoke of the circus games, of a fight he had witnessed between two gladiators, one from Gaul, the other from Thrace, and how the Thracian had won, only to be cut down anyway by the editor of the games, a cruel gesture to please the crowd. Lucilia nodded in all the right places, made soft noises of admiration and dismay. Though her mind wandered, she thought of the gladiator, of what it must be like to be cheered as you bled, to be worshipped as you died. When he finally lay back, satisfied and snoring, Lucilia pulled the thin blanket over his exposed stomach and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the wall where a spider was building a web. Its movements were precise, tireless, patient. She watched it for some time, admiring its work, its resilience, its silence. She wondered what would catch tonight, what would flutter into its trap, unaware and doomed. The room was hot, even with the window cracked open. The man mumbled something in his sleep, some name that wasn't hers. Lucilia reached for the water jug and drank deeply, letting the cool liquid sit in her mouth before swallowing. She felt like a vase left in the sun too long, hairline cracks forming beneath the painted surface, waiting for one careless moment to shatter completely. Eventually, the man woke, adjusted his tunic, muttered a word of thanks or farewell, she could never tell, and left without ceremony. She listened as his footsteps faded down the stairs and into the street. Then came the silence again, and with it, the aching stillness that filled the room like smoke. She stood slowly, stretched her arms, and reached for her comb. The night was still young. There would be others. There always were. And in the silence between them, she would return to the same spot, this same window, watching the moon rise over a city that never truly slept, only shifted its face. The sun, at last, began its slow descent, casting a soft amber hue across the broken rooftops and uneven cobblestones that stretched like veins across the eternal city. The heat that had hung heavily through the afternoon now ebbed slightly, offering just enough relief to allow the skin to breathe without sticking to the linen robes and coarse tunics worn by the poor. For Lucilia, the change in light was not merely a shift in time, but a signal, a quiet bell that rang in her mind, telling her the true part of her day had now begun. The hours before this had merely been prelude, a blur of waiting, cleaning, brief exchanges, and shallow companionship. But now came the dusk, and with it, the real work, the part of her existence that demanded both flesh and performance. The candles in her chamber flickered to life one by one, their flames catching with gentle pops as she lit them with practiced hand, the wax already half melted from previous evenings of repetition. She moved carefully, slowly, as though each motion were rehearsed choreography. A dance performed not for joy, but for the necessity of survival. A bronze mirror, cloudy and spotted with age, reflected her face as she leaned close, studied her own eyes for a moment longer than usual. There was a story there in those irises, not the story of a lover or a muse, but of a laborer. Her beauty, while once bright like fresh marble, now showed the soft erosion of time, not unkind, but evident, like the faded paint on a wall that still holds its pattern. Lucilia reached for a small box carved of cheap pine, its edges worn soft by years of opening and closing. Inside were the tools of her trade. Not coins or perfumes, but pigments made of crushed minerals and wax, a bit of red ochre for the lips, soot-dark powder for the lashes, a touch of white chalk to brighten the eyes. She applied them with care, not out of vanity, but because she knew the exact illusion each smear would cast. These weren't decorations. They were camouflage, armor, masks that turned the weary worker into the illusion of temptation and delight. And yet, as she worked, she thought not of the men who would come, but how each line drawn on her face was a reminder of what she was expected to be, and what she had long ceased to feel. Desired, free, adored. Downstairs in the cramped atrium of the building, voices rose. Laughter, drunkenness, a loud retelling of some crude joke. And Lucilia knew the others were gathering. Some were younger than her now, newer to the trade, still giggling when a man winked or lifted their chin with a coin. They still wore the perfume of hope. But Lucilia had long ago shed that scent, replacing it with one that smelled more like acceptance, a bitter, dry, sore wisdom. She stood, adjusted the straps of her stola, letting it hang slightly looser at the shoulder than was proper, not by mistake, but by strategy. The room was ready. The face was ready. Now it was time for her voice to follow. She descended the creaking staircase with slow, deliberate steps, each one a silent invocation of courage, and entered the alleyway just as the evening shadows swallowed the last remnants of sunlight. The streets were louder now, more crowded. Men returning from public baths, youths lounging against walls with cups of wine, a flutist playing somewhere in the distance. The scent of grilling fish mingled with the sharper odors of sweat, and chamber pots emptied hastily from second-story windows. Rome, in the early evening, was at once alive and indifferent, pulsing, breathing, but never noticing who walked through it unless they begged to be seen. Lucilia's usual spot was near a colonnade, just outside a crumbling temple that no longer received offerings. It was here, beneath its cracked marble steps, that the night's transactions often began. She leaned against one of the pillars, arms crossed loosely, watching people pass. Some glanced her way with a nod. Others looked through her as though she were another part of the ruined stone. But she was not offended. She knew the game. Her clients rarely arrived like lovers in stories. They came like merchants, like shoppers choosing bread or figs. They were men with needs, not hearts. Some were kind, most were not, but all had one thing in common. They paid to forget, just as she was paid to be forgotten. An older man approached first, a baker she'd seen before, his fingers always dusted with flour, his hands too rough to be gentle. He gave her a look and a slight tilt of his head, the kind that said, "You know the place." No need for words. She nodded and followed him without resistance, not because she liked him, she did not, but because he paid promptly and never lingered afterward. The room they used was a borrowed storeroom behind a shop, where amphory of spoiled oil sat gathering dust, and the only light came from a small hole in the ceiling. There in the dark, the exchange happened like it always did. Quick, detached, quiet. He left a few coins on the crate beside her, and muttered a "thank you," as if he'd been served a meal. Lucilia stayed behind for a moment longer, not to collect herself. There was nothing left to gather, but to breathe in the solitude before rejoining the noise outside. She stepped back into the street, eyes adjusting to the dimness, and resumed her position beneath the temple. Others now filled the space. Women she knew by name or not at all, girls with painted lips, men who walked in circles, smiling at strangers. The night was unfolding like a tapestry, each thread connected to 1,000 others, and Lucilia, for all her weariness, was still part of its design. A soldier approached next, young, loud, smelling of wine and sweat and leather. He spoke with bravado, tossing his coin pouch in one hand, boasting of his strength, his victories, his appetite. She listened with practiced interest, nodding when expected, laughing when required, and led him to the same storeroom. He was rougher, clumsier, but not cruel. Afterward, he fell asleep on a sack of grain, and Lucilia quietly collected her fee and slipped away, leaving him to his dreams of conquest. Outside, the moon had risen fully now, casting silver shadows across the cobbles, and the air had cooled enough that her skin prickled. Back beneath the colonnade, Lucilia sat for a while without standing, resting her back against the stone, her head tilted to the side. Around her, Rome buzzed, flickered, groaned, always awake, always hungry, always demanding more. And she, though tired to the marrow, would answer that call as long as she must. But in that moment of quiet, she allowed herself to simply exist, not as a commodity or performance, but as a woman who had endured another turn of the wheel. In the silence that followed, her thoughts drifted not toward escape or anger or longing, but toward nothing, a welcome, weightless emptiness that allowed her eyes to soften and her breathing to slow. For in the midst of the Roman night, beneath the ruins of forgotten gods, Lucilia closed her eyes and rested, if only for a moment, before the next stranger arrived. As the sun dipped further behind the sloping roofs of Subura, casting longer shadows that curled like dark fingers around the narrow alleyways, Lucilia stirred from her temporary rest and began preparing herself for the long, colorless hours of the evening. There was no urgency in her movement, for she had performed this ritual countless times, each gesture already committed to her body's muscle memory. The business of the evening, unlike the raw unpredictability of the day, had a peculiar rhythm of its own, a repetition that numbed the senses. But within that dull routine, she still performed each task with a quiet, deliberate grace, not out of pride, but because it offered her mind a structure, a pattern, a fragile sense of control in a world that seldom offered any. She rose, gently brushing crumbs from her tunic and adjusting the thin fabric that clung to her hips. Her first step was always the same, to cleanse herself. Though her basin was small and the water was never quite warm enough, she dipped her cloth into the earthenware bowl and began wiping her arms, neck, and legs with rhythmic care. She used a pinch of crushed lavender, saved from better days, to scent the water slightly. The oil she applied afterward was one of her few luxuries, bought from a vendor who sold leftover goods smuggled in from provinces, thick, almost rancid olive oil mixed with ground rose petals, sticky and fragrant, clinging to her skin like memory. She applied it slowly, methodically, working it into her arms, collarbone, and throat, trying to coax some softness into the image she would soon present to the world. This was not done out of vanity, nor hope, but obligation. Presentation mattered. The illusion mattered. When she finished, she sat before the small bronze mirror on her table, its surface darkened and pitted by years of use, and tied her hair into the coil not preferred by many Roman men. She then smoothed her eyebrows with spit and pressed a touch of faded rouge to her cheeks. The kohl she applied to her eyes, once meant to allure, had over time become more like armor, something that masked her fatigue, her fear, and her growing indifference. The transformation was not one of identity, but of necessity. The Lucilia who looked back at her in the mirror was not the tired woman who stared at cracks in the ceiling by day. She was a product of fiction wrapped in skin and perfume. With her preparations complete, she drew her curtain open to the hallway. The city was beginning to hum with nocturnal energy. From nearby windows, lamps flickered to life, casting soft golden halos into the darkening alleys. The scent of bread, smoke, and human sweat mingled in the air, creating the familiar bouquet of evening Rome. Downstairs, the tavern had begun to stir with the first of its patrons, loud laughter spilling out into the street, accompanied by the muffled tones of a man tuning his lyre. She could already hear the raspy voice of the owner barking instructions to the serving girls, demanding they fill jugs faster, serve bowls quicker, smile more often. Lucilia descended the stairs with practiced caution. Her sandals tapped softly on the worn stone steps as she passed rooms with open doors, each revealing glimpses of other women like herself, some older, some younger, some already entertaining the first clients of the night. Their voices drifted to the corridor like ghostly echoes, laughter here, silence there. She paused briefly at the landing, adjusting the sash of her tunic, then stepped into the shared courtyard where lanterns burned low and the fire pit sputtered under a pot of spice beans. The evening clientele differed from the daylight wanderers. These were the merchants, the freedmen, the retired soldiers with coin to spend and stories to tell. Many came more for the company than the act. They wanted someone to laugh at their jokes, pretend to admire their scars, touch their hands when speaking. Lucilia understood this well. She had long since learned that the most lucrative moments came not from giving herself entirely, but from pretending she had not already been taken. A well-placed compliment, a feigned interest in a dull anecdote, could mean the difference between a single denarius and a week's worth of bread. So she performed, not with her body, but with her tone, her eyes, her careful silences. Her work now resembled theater more than anything else. Her first patron was a man she recognized, Gaius, a wool merchant from across the Tiber. He came once every few weeks, carrying on about his daughters and his wife, his sore knees and poor digestion. He never stayed long. He liked to drink mulled wine while resting his head in her lap. Speaking of his youth and the days when the world seemed clearer, Lucilia nodded where appropriate, offered smiles and warm words, and placed her hand lightly on his shoulder as he drifted into slurred memory. When he departed, leaving a small coin pouch with a sigh and a comment about old age, She tucked the payment away and washed her hands. Then came others, each with their own moods, expectations, stories. Some were cruel and mocking, treating her as if she were less than the stool they sat on. Others were too soft, too broken, seeking not touch but escape. Lucilia responded accordingly, shifting her manner like water in a vessel, never resisting, only adapting. By midnight, the rhythm of the evening was fully underway. The sound of cups clinking, laughter swelling, and footsteps echoing along the hallway created a constant soundtrack. From one room came the muffled beat of a drum. From another, the low hum of two people whispering close. Lucilia stood by the small back window between clients, sipping from a cup of watered wine. Her mind wandered as she gazed into the darkened alley. A stray cat picked at a pile of fish bones, and a beggar child slept with his back against a crumbling wall. Had bowed in dreams no one would ask about. The city never stopped moving, never stopped needing, and that meant she too must never stop. And yet, within that stillness, Lucilia found a strange comfort. There was a kind of predictability to it all. The harshness of the day, the emptiness of the afternoon, the painted illusion of the night. Each had its place. There was no space for surprises anymore, and perhaps that was a kind of safety. She knew the rules of this life, even if those rules offered her no kindness. As long as she followed them, smile, flatter, yield, survive, she would endure another night. And sometimes, enduring was all she could hope for. By the time the moon had reached its peak and the alleys had quieted once again, Lucilia sat alone in the corner of the common room, her head resting against the cool plaster wall. Her limbs were tired, her lips sore from forced pleasantries, but she had earned enough for a few days of food and perhaps a small vial of better perfume. She did not think beyond that. The future had no place in her world. Only the next hour, the next face, the next coin. With her eyes half closed, she watched the lanterns flicker, shadows dancing across the walls like smoke. She did not know how long she would do this, how long her body would carry her through nights like these. But for now, she would close her eyes for a moment, take a breath, and let the hush of the hour fold over her like a thin, invisible blanket. Lucilia's breath came slow and shallow as the warmth of the afternoon settled thickly on her skin like a second layer, almost too heavy to bear, and the wooden bench beneath her offered no relief, only a reminder that comfort was a luxury few in her trade could afford. The soft hum of distant traffic, a mule cart creaking under the weight of oil amphory, the slap of sandals on sun-baked stone, the occasional bark of a stray dog, filtered into the warped shutters and mingled with the scent of old lavender, stale incense, and the faint tang of iron. With her back pressed gently against the peeling wall and her eyes half closed, she began to feel the pull of that liminal space between waking and sleep, that soft haze where time slowed and worries momentarily dulled. But true rest was rare and fleeting, and as a woman who sold pleasure but seldom felt it herself, Lucilia had long since forgotten what true sleep felt like, untroubled, deep, and uninterrupted by dreams of laughter she hadn't heard or touches she hadn't wanted. It was during these quiet interludes, when her body was momentarily still and her clients had not yet begun knocking again, that her mind drifted to peculiar rhythms of Roman life all around her. She had grown used to the patterns, as every working woman must, and could read the signs of the city's hunger like auguries in smoke. She knew, for instance, that during feast days her clients would come perfumed and overconfident, pockets heavy with coin and minds clouded by wine. She knew that during Senate holidays the city became hushed, almost reverent, and her regulars would sometimes fail to arrive at all, lost in ceremonies or caught up in the politics of the forum. But today was not a feast day, nor a holy one, and the lull that wrapped itself around her room was not one of civic rest, but rather one of emotional exhaustion, as if the entire quarter was catching its breath after too many nights of indulgence. The brothel had been unusually busy these past few days, and even the madam, a sharp-eyed woman named Petronia who rarely showed fatigue, had appeared drawn and tight-lipped when she counted coins that morning. Lucilia had served 8 men in 2 days, and though she was paid, it was not enough to erase the weariness that settled in her limbs like cold water soaking into cloth. She rose from the bench with a deep sigh, her fingers trailing the uneven edge of the windowsill, and peered outside for a moment. The sun hung like a hammered disk above the rooftops, turning terracotta tiles into small ovens and throwing hard shadows between the stalls below. A fig seller argued half-heartedly with a pair of older women, while a cluster of beggar children chased one another in the dust, their laughter surprisingly light given the hunger in their bellies. Somewhere to the north, beyond the tenements and the walled gardens of the wealthier districts, Lucilia knew the Tiber moved slowly, its surface dappled with a reflection of sky, and the spindly silhouettes of fishing nets cast by men with sun-leather hands. She had not seen the river in months, not since last autumn, when she had dared to walk beyond the familiar boundaries of Sabura to visit a sick cousin. That cousin had died, as most poor people did, quietly, without a physician, in a room that smelled of vinegar and boiled onions. Lucilia had stayed the night back then, not because she could afford the time, but because grief made everything else feel irrelevant for a while. That memory returned to her now, uninvited, and it came a dull ache beneath her ribs. She turned away from the window and moved toward the small bronze mirror that hung crooked on the wall, its polished surface now clouded and dulled by time. Her reflection greeted her with indifference. Lines etched by candlelight, circles like shadows beneath her eyes, lips still touched faintly with the rouge she had applied that morning. She adjusted the thin fabric of her stola and dabbed at her forehead with a bit of cloth soaked in rose water, though the scent had long faded. The act of tending to her face was not for vanity, but for survival. Men did not pay for fatigue. They paid for illusion. And that illusion required upkeep, no matter how broken she felt behind it. She heard footsteps outside, heavy, hesitant, and recognized the gate. It was Marius, a baker from the next street over. A kind man, relatively speaking, who always left a little extra when he visited, though he seldom stayed longer than a few minutes. He had a wife, Lucilia knew, and children who waited for him near the market stalls. Still, he came often, and always with that same look in his eyes. Part shame, part need, part something unnamed that hovered just beyond the reach of words. Lucilia opened the door before he could knock, stepping aside silently to let him in. There were no pleasantries exchanged. This was not a house of affection, but of arrangement. Marius placed a few denarii on the table, more than usual, and Lucilia nodded once before slipping the coins into the pouch beneath her cushion. She guided him toward the cot, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Not with love, not even with friendship, but with a quiet understanding of two souls making do with the world they had been given. When it was over, he dressed in silence and left without a word, his footsteps fading into the laughter of children and the clang of the blacksmith's forge. Lucilia sat back down and poured herself a little wine, diluted with water, and stared again at the mirror. The day was not yet done, and already it felt like a lifetime had passed. She allowed herself a long, slow breath and leaned back, listening to the house breathe with her. Creaking beams, distant footsteps, the slow churn of footsteps on stone. Another knock would come, sooner or later. The sun would dip, the streets would cool, and men would again seek out warmth that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the weight of their own loneliness. Lucilia knew this. She had known it for years. But for now, in this brief pocket of stillness between one appointment and the next, she closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and allowed her thoughts to float upward, away from the walls, away from the city, and toward the imagined scent of jasmine in a garden she had never visited. As night finally stretched its veil over Rome, casting long shadows along the weathered stone walls and cloaking the alleyways in a softness that daylight never allowed, Lucilia moved with a kind of quiet grace through the narrow hall that led to her chamber. The air was cooler now, touched by a subtle breeze that carried with it the scent of olive oil, lingering smoke from street torches, and the faint, distant notes of a lyre being strummed somewhere out in the dark. It was a time of day when the city exhaled, when the clangor of carts, the shrill cries of hawkers, and the tramp of soldiers faded into an evening hush. The city, though never truly still, shifted its energy as the sun vanished behind the hills, and for the women of the lower quarters, like Lucilia, the night offered no rest, but instead promised fresh labor beneath a different kind of expectation. She lit her small oil lamp, the wick sputtering before catching flame, and the golden glow spilled gently across the room. It flickered on the cracked plaster, danced over the rough grain of the wooden table, and illuminated the single iron ring that hung above her bed frame, a ring used for support or spectacle or survival. These simple objects, lamps, blankets, wine jugs, threadbare sandals left by the door, spoke of a life built on repetition, where each item carried the silent weight of necessity and routine. She sat for a moment, brushing out her hair with slow, deliberate strokes, not for beauty or pleasure, but because it helped soothe her nerves, helped anchor her in the present before the next hour arrived. Each pull of the comb whispered through her thick strands like wind through reeds. There was always a certain stillness before the first knock of the night, a moment stretched taut with anticipation. Would the man be gentle or impatient, a soldier or a merchant, old or young, silent or boastful? The unpredictability of it no longer frightened her. It had long since passed beyond fear. But it kept her guarded, always alert beneath a mask of practiced ease. She knew how to read the signs quickly. The twitch of an eye, the set of a jaw, the looseness or stiffness of movement. Years of working had trained her into an intuitive strategist, not unlike the gamblers who played dice in the taverns, always calculating odds and risks with every glance. The knock came just after she had poured a modest goblet of wine. Not too loud, not too soft. She rose, smoothed her tunic, and answered with her usual calm. The man who entered was tall, draped in the dark folds of a well-worn toga, smelling faintly of vinegar and sweat. He looked around her room briefly, as they always did, as if seeing would reveal something about her, though it never did, and then settled into the edge of the bed, speaking softly, half in thought. He was not cruel, not unkind, merely tired, like most of them were. She recognized the type, a man worn down by too many obligations, seeking a brief moment of distraction, not ecstasy, not power, but a moment where he didn't have to carry anyone else's expectations. Lucilia poured the wine and handed him the cup, her movements smooth and fluid. They talked for a few minutes, small and harmless conversation, the kind that filled empty air without requiring intimacy. He asked where she had grown up, and she gave him a name, not her real one, but one she kept in reserve for men like him. Men who wanted a story, a distant village, a lost love, something to believe in for just a moment. She watched his face soften as he listened, not quite believing, but wanted to believe, and she allowed him that. Sometimes the illusion was more valuable than the act itself. It was a performance in a way, but no less sincere than the plays performed in the Forum's shadow theaters. The night passed without incident. Afterward, he lingered a moment, drinking the last sip of wine before placing the cup gently on the table. He said little as he left, and she did not expect thanks. As the door clicked shut behind him, Lucilia let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She washed the cup slowly, wiped the bed linens with a damp cloth, and tucked away the coin he had left. Modest, but enough to buy a loaf of bread and a few olives for the next day. The room felt warmer now, not from the lamp but from the quiet that had returned. She sat once more at the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. The sounds of the city came in softly now, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the murmured laughter of men in nearby quarters. Somewhere a flute was being played, high and lonely, and the notes drifted to the night like strands of smoke. She listened without really hearing, letting her thoughts drift as the weight of fatigue settled into her limbs. These hours between men, between obligation and sleep, were the only ones that truly belonged to her. There was no glamour in the life she led, no great drama, no mythic narrative like those of the noble women whose names fill poetry and marble. But there was something deeply human in it all. The resilience, the quiet strength, the capacity to endure the sameness of each day while still holding on to a shred of something untouched inside her. Whether it was pride or defiance or simply habit, she didn't know, but it was hers. She glanced at the corner where a small, worn figurine of Venus stood, clay chipped at the base, arms missing, but still standing. She had found it years ago, discarded in the dirt outside a shrine, and had brought it home without knowing why. It had watched over her ever since. Not that she believed the goddess would offer protection, but perhaps it was good to be reminded that even broken things could be beautiful, could be sacred in their own quiet way. The lamp burned low, the oil nearly spent. Lucilia wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved to the window, where she rested her elbows on the sill and looked out at the moonlight painting silver edges on the rooftops. The sky was a wash of deep blue and starlight, and for a brief moment she felt still, not trapped, not waiting, just present. She whispered something into the dark. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a word she no longer remembered. Then she stepped back, lay down on the thin mattress, and closed her eyes. The night was not over. It rarely was. But for now, in this small sliver of peace, she allowed herself to drift in the quiet, knowing that morning would come again, and with it, the same rhythm, the same faces, the same weight. But tonight, there was silence. And silence in a world so loud was its own kind of sanctuary. As the sky above Rome began to deepen into the cooler indigos of early evening, the city seemed to shift in tone, and Lucilia felt the air around her take on a different weight. The streets, once dominated by merchants, slaves, and some fatigued citizens, now gave way to shadows and flickering lamplight. The clatter of wooden cartwheels grew sparse, and instead, the soft percussion of sandals brushing over cobblestones took their place. This time of day, neither fully day nor truly night, held a special rhythm for women like Lucilia. It was a moment of preparation, not just in attire or cosmetics, but in mind and mood. There was an art to slipping from the dull weariness of the daytime into the careful illusion of allure, and it began not with powders or perfumes but with silence and thought. She moved slowly through her room, her bare feet soundless on the stone floor, gathering the tools of her nightly transformation. A brass mirror, its surface dull with time, but still faithful enough to catch the light. A tiny box of crushed minerals for color. A few wilting sprigs of lavender meant to freshen the stale air. And of course, the simple tunic she had reserved for the evening. A dyed piece in faded crimson, chosen because it still clung flatteringly to her figure despite its fraying edges. She laid everything out with care, the way a soldier might prepare their armor, with precision born from repetition. Then she sat. The small wooden stool creaked beneath her, its legs uneven. She leaned toward the mirror, studying her face, not for vanity, but for readiness. There was a difference between beauty and the expression of it, between the face she wore in solitude and the one she wore for the night. She darkened her eyes slightly with charcoal dust and pinched her cheeks to bring a flush to their pale surfaces. She dabbed perfume oil at her wrists and behind her ears, using only what little she could spare. Then she turned to her hair, smoothing it back into an elegant knot. Held by a bronze pin she had once stolen from a client who had passed out mid-sentence. The final touch was her posture, not physical, but internal. She coaxed herself into the role, into the identity the city expected of her after dusk. It was not deception, not entirely. Rather, it was survival polished into performance. A mask that resembled her, but softer, more enticing, less worn by pain. Outside, the voices were changing. Deeper, louder, more confident. Men began to emerge from taverns and baths, their voices thick with wine and laughter. Some women joined them. Others, like Lucilia, watched and waited. Evening was a time of competition, of games played with glances and gestures. Every flick of the eye, every brush of a hand against fabric, became a signal. It was a theater of bodies and movement. And so, with one last look at herself, Lucilia opened the door and stepped into the corridor, where the air smelled of oil lamps and unspoken secrets. Flavia was there, already painted and poised, leaning against the wall with arms crossed and a wry smile. She gave Lucilia a nod of approval, unspoken affirmation that the mask looked convincing enough tonight. Together, they descended the steps and emerged into the streets. The city was alive with slower pulse now. The heat softened, the torches sputtering with amber light. The brothel's door was propped open, and already a few regular clients lounged inside, sipping wine and tossing dice on low tables. The madam sat in her usual chair, draped in heavy fabrics, her lips drawn in a firm line of expectation. Lucilia offered a slight bow of her head, more gesture than greeting, and took her place near the back wall. She did not rush forward or speak loudly. The trick was to be noticed, but not too quickly. The regulars knew her, of course. They always did. But even familiarity had its price. She needed to balance approachability with mystique, a dance she had mastered over time. The first man to approach was a merchant she'd seen many times before, plump, with a sweaty brow and fingers that smelled perpetually of olives. He was kind enough, in his way, always paying without haggling, always leaving promptly afterward. He sat beside her, his words slurred already, and told her again how much he admired her patience. She smiled and nodded, speaking little, letting him fill the silence with his own stories. It wasn't always about the act, not for all clients. Some, like him, came seeking comfort in the form of closeness, in the warmth of a listening ear and the illusion of intimacy. Lucilia gave him that. She listened. She leaned close. She let him believe she cared. And in that moment, perhaps she almost did. Not for him, but for the strange fragility he exposed in his wine-soaked confessions. He was not unlike her in that sense, performing a version of himself to survive the expectations placed on him. When they finally retired to her chamber, it was brief and without urgency. He left her coins, more than he owed, and kissed her hand with trembling lips before departing into the street. She sat for a while after he left, the room still warm with his presence. She didn't move to clean immediately, didn't undress or prepare for the next man. Instead, she leaned against the wall and stared out the window at the narrow sliver of sky that remained visible. A few stars had begun to appear. In another life, perhaps she might have been one of the women who strolled the forum in fine tunics, laughing behind silk veils, corded with poetry instead of coin. But this was her world. The brothel, the mirror, the wine, and the masks. And she wore them as well as anyone could. As the deepening afternoon crept slowly toward evening, and the light began to soften against the ancient, time-worn stones of Sabura, Lucilia rose from the stool by the window, the hem of her stola brushing lightly against her ankles. Her limbs felt heavy, not only from physical labor, but from the emotional sediment that collected within her after hours of listening, responding, pretending, and enduring. With each client, a different version of herself had been summoned, worn like a mask, then folded away again like a frayed costume tucked beneath the bed. Now, in this hour just before twilight, the real Lucilia, if there was still such a person, would briefly emerge to inhabit the quiet. It was a time of subtle transition in the streets below. The laborers returned from the fields or workshops, dragging their callous feet toward the promise of bread and rest. The children, earlier noisy and chaotic, were being pulled inside by weary mothers. The baker's apprentices, streaked with flour, darted past with baskets on their hips, and the smell of warm loaves filled the air in waves. Comforting and familiar, the city still breathed, but more slowly now, as if its enormous chest were rising and falling in preparation for sleep. Inside her room, Lucilia knelt beside the basin in the corner and began her ritual of washing again, her hands careful and methodical as she ran the damp cloth across her skin. The water was tepid, but it soothed her in small ways, not because it removed the day entirely, but because it offered a kind of symbolic separation from it. She had learned long ago that she would never be fully clean, not in the eyes of society, not in the scriptures read aloud in temples, not in the muttered judgments of matrons passing the street, but she had found comfort in the rhythm of purification. There was serenity in the act itself, not because it absolved her, but because it belonged only to her. When her body had been rinsed and patted dry with an old but soft cloth, she selected a new tunic for the evening, a deeper red, one that caught the lantern light in ways she thought might be pleasing to the next pair of eyes that watched her undress. And there would be more eyes. There were always more. As the sky shifted from the dusty oranges of a Roman sunset to the deep purples that warned of nightfall, Lucilia began to prepare for the second shift of her day. The evening brought not only more clients, but a different kind. These were not the hurried, midday men who paid for convenience or anonymity. These were the ones who lingered, who drank too much, who asked questions she had no intention of answering. Some wanted to talk more than touch. Others pretended they were in love with her, weaving elaborate fantasies in which she was their mistress or muse, their secret longing brought to life. Still others brought gifts, cheap trinkets or stolen fruit, as if they could buy her affection with something beyond coins. She did not reject these gestures. That would have been poor business. But neither did she accept them as anything more than tactics, tools, illusions of romance forged in the flicker of oil lamps and wine-dulled senses. Before the darkness fell completely, she lit a small clay lamp and placed it in the niche above her bed. Its golden glow danced across the walls, softening the sharp corners of the room and making the cracked plaster look momentarily like something deliberate, something artistic. She dabbed scented oil, imported from Hispania, but watered down to stretch it further, along her collarbone and behind her ears. These small rituals, repeated nightly, had come to hold meaning far beyond their purpose. They were not just for allure. They were anchors, markers of time, reminders that she still had control over small things. The lighting of the lamp, the scent on her skin, the way she pinned her hair back into its familiar style. In a life dictated so often by the needs and desires of others, such rituals were acts of quiet defiance. There was a kind of silence, then a pause in the world. Before the first knock of the evening, she felt it before she heard it. A shift in the energy of the building, the soft scurry of a neighbor preparing in her own room, the creak of feet climbing the stairs. The knock itself was gentle, practiced, a rhythm she'd heard 100 times. Lucilia opened the door, her face already arranged into a welcoming half-smile, the kind that suggested warmth without enthusiasm. The man was unfamiliar, though not surprising. A young soldier, barely older than a boy, his armor dusty, his gaze nervous. He held a small pouch of coins in one hand and removed his helmet with the other, as if stepping into a shrine. She motioned him in without a word, closed the door behind him, and guided him toward the bed. The script would unfold as it always did. He would speak softly at first, then more boldly. He would drink if she offered wine, which she sometimes did. He would undress awkwardly, quickly, then lie back and wait, his face expectant and unsure. And Lucilia would begin the performance. She would speak in soothing tones, perhaps run her fingers across his shoulder in a way that made him feel desired. She would let him believe he was special, that this night was unlike all others, that his touch stirred something deep within her. It was an illusion, carefully crafted, and she had mastered it with years of practice. He would leave, eventually, and thank her as if she had given him something rare, and perhaps, in some small way, she had, though not what he believed. She had given him comfort, perhaps a fleeting sense of intimacy, a respite from loneliness or fear or whatever shadows trailed him in the dark. But when he was gone, she would not remember his name. She had learned never to remember names. It was better that way. Safer. The hours that followed were much the same. Another knock, another man, another mask. Sometimes they blurred together, and she found herself losing the thread of her own narrative. Who had she pretended to be for that senator's aide? What story had she told the baker, who visited each third evening? But she never stumbled. Her role, though exhausting, was one she knew intimately. She adjusted it slightly with each visitor, like a singer altering pitch to suit the room. Some wanted laughter, so she laughed. Some wanted silence, so she said nothing. Some wanted to cry, so she held them. She did not question it. She simply endured, adapted, survived. And then, at last, there would come the final knock, or no knock at all. There were nights when the client stopped coming early, when she was left with a strange sensation of waiting for something that never arrived. On those nights, she would sit by the window again, lantern flickering, and listen to the voices of Rome echo through the narrow streets. Lovers quarreling, drunks singing, distant horns of the city guard calling change a watch. The city never slept entirely, but within her small chamber, she could sometimes find the illusion of rest. She would lie back, fully clothed, unwilling to touch the sheets just yet, and let her mind wander. Sometimes it drifted back to childhood memories, a fig tree near her father's house, or the pattern of her mother's shawl. Other times it imagined distant futures that could never be, lives in quiet villas by the sea, or a bakery of her own with a dog by the door. Eventually, sleep would take her, not gently, but with a suddenness that startled her as much as it relieved her. The dreams came, and in them, there were no clients, no lanterns, no knocks. Only waves, or gardens, or silence. As the sun dipped lower, bathing the worn stones of Rome in a heavy gold of twilight, Lucilia moved with slow steps down the narrow corridor leading to the rear courtyard of the building. Her sandals scraped against the uneven floor, the faint echo of her movements swallowed by the hum of nearby voices and the rustle of fabric as other tenants prepared for another restless night. Her body ached in quiet places, from the tension in her calves to the dull pull behind her shoulders, and yet the motions of her day had become so rehearsed that the pain felt like just another note in a familiar melody, one she could hum without needing to listen. As she passed the dripping cistern, she reached into a cracked terracotta basin and splashed cold water against her arms and face, not out of necessity, but as a small ritual transition, a symbolic washing away of the long day's weariness, a meager refreshment before the darker hours began to claim her. The courtyard, though surrounded by soot-streaked stone and broken steps, had the kind where that hinted at layers of forgotten stories, as if its very structure had grown tired of change. Lucilia sat on a bench by a climbing fig vine whose limbs clung desperately to decaying plaster, and for a long moment she allowed herself stillness. She was not alone. Far from it. Other women slowly emerged, each in varying states of preparation. Some fixed their tunics with rough pins or dabbed rose oil behind their ears, while others tied up their hair. Pushing back curls of the Roman air had pulled loose throughout the day. Though no one spoke at first, their eyes carried a quiet solidarity. Not exactly friendship, but a knowing, an unspoken recognition of shared burdens carried in silence. Eventually, Marcia sat beside her, her sharp elbows brushing lightly against Lucilia's as she adjusted her robe. Marcia had a kind of laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Lucilia had learned that her constant chatter was both a mask and a shield, a way of insulating herself from the biting reality that hovered just beneath their existence. "Busy night ahead," Marcia muttered, smoothing a crease in her dress that would not smooth. "There's a group of Gauls in from the port, loud as donkeys and probably twice as drunk. The barkeep said they've coins to spend, though might be worth the headache." Lucilia nodded but said nothing. She had learned that sometimes stillness was more comforting than optimism, especially when that optimism came wrapped in the jangling sounds of foreign tongues in careless hands. The sun finally slipped behind the tenements, leaving only the long gray shadows of laundry lines and crumbling walls. Lamps began to flicker to life along the street, oil-fed and smoky, their soft glow filtering through open shutters like ancient eyes blinking slowly in the dusk. With the night fully drawn, Lucilia rose. Her room, if it could be called that, was little more than a corner above the taverna kitchen, where steam and spice clung to the walls like old memories. She dressed without ceremony, choosing a simple dyed stola that smelled faintly of citrus and ashes, and pinned a bronze clasp at her shoulder, though it had lost its polish long ago. Her sandals were worn at the soles, but they still held together, and in her little clay mirror, her reflection was just clear enough to press a bit of rouge to her cheeks. The rouge wasn't for beauty. Not really. It was more like armor, paying for a kind of battlefield where charm replaced weaponry. And wit was often her only defense. The tavern below was already buzzing, the kind of noise that rose and fell in rhythms of laughter, shouted bets, and slurred Latin. The air was thick with the smell of roasted chickpeas, onions fried in old oil, and the sharp tang of wine poured too generously. Lucilia descended the stairs, her hand grazing the railing that was smooth from years of palms passing over it. As she entered the common room, she was immediately absorbed into its chaos. Her presence acknowledged not with fanfare, but with a flicker of recognition from the bartender and a few lingering stares from patrons too deep in their cups to pretend discretion. She moved between tables with the grace of someone who had done this too many times to stumble, nodding at familiar faces. Merchants, off-duty guards, sailors whose arms bore tattoos of ships and serpents, before settling into a bench near the hearth waiting. There was no set rhythm to how the evening would unfold, only patterns shaped by intuition and chance. Some nights were loud and demanding, filled with touch and transaction, where she had entertained with stories or faint amusement at crude jokes, all while keeping one eye on the exit. Other nights, like this one, unfolded slowly, stretching across hours like a soft and fraying thread. A centurion approached her table eventually, younger than most, his armor removed and his tunic creased from travel. He spoke softly, asked if she'd sit with him, and offered wine before touching her. She preferred this kind. Tired men with questions about the city, or stories from campaigns they could not quite forget. They were gentler in their loneliness, and she gave them what they wanted. Warmth, the illusion of being understood, a night without judgment. They talked. About nothing really. About the weather across the sea, about his mother who used to keep olives in vinegar jars on the balcony, about how the city's fountains reminded him of a spring near his old villa. She listened, nodding in time with his words, careful not to let her thoughts drift. It was a strange skill, to be present and absent at once, to offer the right expressions, the right sighs and smiles, while the heart remained hidden, folded beneath layers of weariness. When he finally reached for her hand, his palm was calloused, the grip unfamiliar but not unkind. She stood, guiding him wordlessly up the stairs, the sounds of the tavern softening beneath them like a curtain drawn over a stage. Their room was small and the bed smelled faintly of mildew, but the lamp cast a dim, flattering light. She undressed with practiced slowness, not to seduce but to control the pace. He was quiet, thankfully, and when they lay together, it was more like two strangers seeking warmth in winter than any kind of passion. Afterwards, as he drifted into a heavy, wine-sweet sleep, Lucilia remained awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, tracing the lines with her eyes as if they were roads leading somewhere far away. Her thoughts wandered to the scent of figs on hot afternoons, to the sound of her brother's voice years ago, calling to her from a fishing boat. She had not seen the sea in so long. Downstairs, the tavern roared on, voices rising and falling like waves against a wooden hull. But in this small room, time stood still for a few long minutes, holding her in a quiet that was not peace but something adjacent to it. And in that quiet, Lucilia closed her eyes, not to sleep but to retreat, to preserve a piece of herself untouched by the night's labor. She knew that soon she would rise again, redress, and return to the flickering lamps and watchful eyes. But for now, she simply breathed. The next morning unfurled not with fanfare or sunlight, but with a dull grayness of sky heavy with city smoke and kitchen soot, as if Rome itself had drawn a thick curtain over the heavens to keep its dwellers trapped in shadow. Lucilia awoke with the softest flutter of her eyelids, her body still coiled in position she had taken hours earlier beside the now empty bed. The centurion had already gone, leaving behind a few copper coins stacked carefully on the edge of the cracked wash basin, and the faintest smell of the skin pressed into the linen. She did not touch the coins right away, nor did she rise with haste. Instead, she lay there motionless, allowing the silence to settle over her shoulders like a veil, each breath slow and deliberate, as though drawing air through cloth soaked in time. Her eyes traced the water stains on the ceiling, faded patches that resembled the borders of forgotten provinces, curled and reshaped by countless rains and leaking pipes, a map of nowhere that only she had memorized in moments like this. When she finally sat up, the floor was cold beneath her feet, and her back gave a quiet protest as she straightened herself. The aches were familiar now, reliable companions that greeted her every dawn, not with cruelty, but with the quiet persistence of age creeping in too early. She reached for a folded cloth and wrapped her shoulders before stepping toward the basin, where the coins still waited like little bronze witnesses to the life she had sold in hours. The water in the jug beside it was stale and metallic, but she poured it anyway, splashing her face and neck until she felt herself return to her skin. She tied her hair back, not out of vanity, but to keep it from the smoke and oil that would soon rise again from the kitchens below. And as she smoothed the linen of her tunic and picked up the coins, each one carefully counted in her head, she slipped them into a hollow brick behind the wooden cupboard, where a small stash had begun to gather like a horde of quiet victories, one evening at a time. Downstairs, the tavern was still. The embers in the hearth had long since cooled, and only the barkeep shuffled about in silence, his eyes heavy from too little sleep and too much wine spilled on his apron. He grunted a half-greeting as Lucilia entered, and she replied with a nod, reaching for a cloth to help clear the tables. The remains of last night's revelry lay scattered, cracked clay cups, crusts of flatbread hardened like stone, and a few tokens of revelry that had no home, a sandal strap, a bloodied napkin, a broken necklace bead that rolled beneath a chair with a sound like falling rain. She cleaned without words, her hands moving automatically, each gesture part of a rhythm that had long since become her second language. She did not need to be asked or told. The tavern would be made ready again, as it always was, its filth scrubbed away for the next night's stories and stumblings, and she would be there to witness them, both within and apart. By midday, the streets outside had awakened to the usual dissonance. The call of vendors shouting over one another, the clatter of wheels against stone, the cries of children chasing each other through alleys with olive pits clutched in sticky fists. The city had no silence. Even in its quietest corners, it buzzed with a life too large to pause, too proud to rest. Lucilia stepped outside to mark it briefly, the coins in her pouch pressing against her side like tiny reminders of who she was and what she must do. She moved through the crowd with purpose but without hurry, selecting vegetables with practiced eye, haggling without speaking more than necessary, always listening for shifts in tone or changes in glance. The butcher offered her a discount she hadn't asked for, his hand lingering slightly on her wrist as he passed the wrapped meat. She said nothing, only withdrew her hand smoothly, neither rejecting nor encouraging, and moved on with the same steady grace that had carried her through so many encounters like this, moments steeped not in danger, but in fatigue that was perhaps worse, the dull certainty of being observed not as a person, but as something to be weighed and claimed. Back in her quarters, she cooked with minimal ingredients, lentils, onions, and a few crushed herbs she had bartered for last week. The scent filled the narrow stairwell and drew Marcia up from the courtyard below, her face already bright with forced cheerfulness. "You cook better than the tavern itself," she said, sliding onto the stool with her usual flair, pulling her robes tight around her knees. Lucilia smiled faintly and handed her a bowl, knowing full well that Marcia had not eaten since yesterday. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that did not strain or weigh, but wrapped itself around them like a cloak. After some time, Marcia spoke again, this time softer. "Did you ever think of leaving?" she asked, not looking up from her food. "Not to somewhere grand. Just away. Somewhere with less noise. Less memory." Lucilia did not answer at first. Her fingers traced the rim of her bowl, and she let her gaze drift toward the shutter, where a breeze stirred the edge of the curtain. "Every day," she replied, finally. "But dreams are heavy, and I don't carry enough hands to hold them all." Marcia said nothing more, and they ate until the bowls were empty. As afternoon deepened, the weight of the day began to settle in the walls of the city. Shadows stretched longer in the alleys, and the orange glow of late sunlight kissed the broken columns and statues with a softness they did not often receive. Lucilia stood in the doorway for a time, watching the world move without her, observing the flutter of a pigeon's wings as it launched from a rooftop, the swirl of dust at a child's heel, the glint of a coin exchanged too quickly. These moments, the ones between labor and labor, between voice and silence, were the ones she treasured most. They reminded her that she was still herself beneath the masks, that somewhere beneath the soot and the painted rouge, there remained a girl who once believed the world would be more forgiving than it had turned out to be. That evening, as preparations resumed once more, lamps cleaned, hair braided, smiles rehearsed, Lucilia moved slower than usual, her body heavier than it had been in weeks. Perhaps it was a change in weather, or perhaps the dreams Marcia spoke of had settled too deeply in her bones. But even as she descended the steps again, into the flickering candlelight and rising laughter of the taverna, she carried within her the shape of something unsaid, an ache that could not be named, and yet which made itself known in every step, every glance, every sigh. She sat at the far edge of the room, letting others approach her rather than seeking them, and as the noise swelled again like a tide returning to shore, she simply watched. She watched the faces blur with wine and weariness, watched the hands that reached for bread and pleasure, watched the doors open and close with a steady rhythm of fate. And in that watching, she found a kind of stillness, not peace perhaps, but a momentary ceasefire. The world, for all its cruelty and noise, did not crush her. Not yet. She was still there, still present, still breathing. And that, in its own quiet way, was a triumph. There was a stillness in Sabura now, not the quiet stillness of countryside mornings or temple courtyard of prayer, but tense, taut silence, the kind that settled in the brief moment between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. Lucilia stood in the alley just beyond her doorway, the cool stone pressing to the soles of her sandals, her breath visible in little puffs despite the season. The torches along the street hissed quietly, their flames beaten to shivers by a breeze that smelled of wine, ash, and the salted sweat of men returning from the baths. It was late, and most of the day's deals had already been struck, most of the willing bought or passed by. But for a woman like Lucilia, there were still moments to catch, moments when a soldier wandered out of step with his unit, or a senator's slave, charged with errands, lingered too long in a shadowed corner. She didn't call out, not tonight. Some nights she did, her voice practiced and low, Her offers veiled in innuendo or laid bare in crude Latin, depending on the hour and the listener. But tonight she leaned against the bricks and let the city bring its people to her. Rome, after all, had a way of feeding its streets like a mother feeds children, not always with kindness, not always with timing, but steadily. She watched a group of young men stagger past, one of them clutching a garland of wilted laurel in a hand stained purple from too much Falernian. They looked at her, laughed, then moved on. She didn't mind. There was something almost tender in being ignored when it came from boys too drunk to remember their own names by morning. A figure approached, not fast, not slow, his steps even and unfaltering. Lucilia could tell from the outline that he was not drunk, not entirely at least, and not poor. His toga was stained at the hem, but it was of good wool, and he walked with the posture of someone used to being served. She let him come close before she straightened, not stiffly, but with a kind of practiced grace that suggested she was both approachable and indifferent. They didn't speak at first. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her like a man inspecting a painting he had already decided to purchase. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I don't want much," he said. "Just someone to sit with me for a while." Lucilia said nothing at first, then gave a small nod and stepped forward. There were many kinds of clients in Rome, she had learned, and sometimes the loneliest ones were the easiest to bear. They turned together and disappeared down the alley, the street behind them returning to its quiet rhythms. The alleyway led to a side courtyard, quiet and partially hidden, with a flickering light of a nearby oil lamp painted long, moving shadows on the cracked walls. They walked in silence, Lucilia and the man, his steps calm but uncertain, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground despite having walked these streets all his life. There were no sudden movements, no drunken leering or barked commands. He simply sat down on a worn stone bench beside a dry fountain and looked up toward the strip of night sky barely visible between the crowded rooftops. Lucilia sat beside him, neither too near nor too far, letting the silence stretch like a thread, gently pulling them into a space outside of business and beyond the expectations of the night. For a long while, neither of them spoke, and she appreciated that more than he could know. Words had been too frequent in her day, shouted down hallways, whispered with promises, spat with curses, or murmured in exhaustion. To be silent with someone was, strangely, more intimate than being touched. The man rubbed his hands together slowly, not from cold but from habit, as though working through a thought without speaking it aloud. When he did finally speak, his words were soft, as if not meant to be heard by the stones beneath their feet. "I used to come here when I was a boy," he said, his eyes on the shadowed rim of the fountain, "before the water dried up, before the ivy grew through the cracks. Everything used to seem taller then, louder too." Lucilia nodded slowly, not because she had been here as a child. She hadn't. But because she understood what he meant. Places held memory. They held the shape of people long gone, the weight of voices now silent. Rome was full of ghosts, not just the ones that haunted the temples and tombs, but the quieter ones. The child who once laughed in a now empty courtyard, the old woman who used to sell honey cakes from a basket that had since crumbled into dust. The man sighed, a slow breath that sounded more tired than sad. "I thought I wanted something else when I came out tonight," he admitted. "But now I think I just wanted to remember something that no longer exists." Lucilia reached down and touched the edge of the stone seat, grounding herself in the rough surface, feeling the coolness of it through her fingers. She didn't offer comfort. She knew better than to fill the silence with platitudes. Instead, she let the moment exist, unspoiled by explanations or obligations. They sat like that for a long time, two strangers bound not by desire, but by something softer, the ache of remembering and the peace of being remembered. Eventually, the stillness of the night pressed just enough to encourage movement, not out of urgency, but from the natural rhythm of a moment finding its close. The man stood first, not suddenly, not with any finality, but like a tree bending back after the breeze has passed. Lucilia followed, brushing the hem of her dress lightly as she rose, her fingers briefly trailing along the stone bench as if to leave behind some part of quiet that had settled there with them. The lamp near the courtyard sputtered faintly, its flame dimmer now, as if it too had grown weary of keeping vigil in the dark. They walked slowly back toward the edge of the alley, not quite side by side, and yet not apart. Lucilia didn't ask for payment. The man didn't offer. It wasn't a transaction anymore. Not really. What passed between them had no price. Just a shared pause in lives usually rushed and worn thin. At the mouth of the alley, where the soft noise of the street reawakened with distant laughter and the bark of a dog echoing down the stone paths, he turned to her once more, not with expectation, but with something quieter. "Thank you," he said, voice barely louder than the wind shifting through the tiled roofs. Lucilia nodded, her expression unreadable in the shadow, yet not cold, not closed, just a calm kind of acceptance. She had learned to carry moments like this one with a careful balance, not clutching them too tightly, lest they slip into longing, but not dismissing them either. Some encounters were meant to be remembered gently and then released, like a dream half remembered at dawn. As he walked away, his figure slowly disappearing into bronze and shadow hues of Rome's nighttime streets, Lucilia lingered by the wall a while longer. Her eyes drifted upward to where the stars tried to peer through the urban canopy, and though they rarely sparkled clearly in the city's glow, tonight she imagined they looked a little brighter. Or maybe it was just that her eyes had grown more patient, more willing to see even the faintest light. She adjusted her shawl around her shoulders, the cloth still holding some of the warmth from the man's quiet presence beside her. And then, without haste, she turned back toward her path. Not toward the brothel just yet, but instead down a different alley, slower, softer, unhurried. The night wasn't over, but it had shifted. Something in it had settled, like dust in a sunbeam, floating gently before finding rest. As Lucilia stepped into the final stretch of her walk, the city felt quieter than it had in hours. The fires and the braziers had burned low, and the far-off clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestones had faded into a deep, late-night silence. The streets she wandered were now cloaked in shadows softened by moonlight, and the shuttered windows of tall Roman instantly stood like closed eyes, resting at last in the day's unending blink. There was no rush in her steps, only the kind of deliberate movement that belongs to someone who is in no hurry to arrive, because the moment itself had become enough. Lucilia walked with one hand gently brushing along the coarse stone wall beside her, letting its cool texture guide her. She passed doorways she knew well, past faces that would be waiting tomorrow, some friendly, others forgettable, but none of that mattered just now. The echo of quiet footsteps behind her had long since vanished. She was alone in the best sense of the word. Alone but not lonely, full but not burdened, carried forward not by obligation but by rhythm, the rhythm of night, of breath, of slow understanding. She reached a small fountain tucked into the curve of a narrow courtyard, its trickling sound barely audible over the stillness, yet constant, like a whispered reassurance from the city itself. Leaning over, she dipped her fingers into the cold water, letting it slip between them, feeling its cleansing pass as a final gesture from this evening. The stars above remained distant and faint, but they were there, and Lucilia tilted her head back just enough to acknowledge them. She had always liked the stars, even when they seemed indifferent. They watched, and that was enough. With the last stretch of the path before her, she turned toward the brothel's rear entrance, the place where she entered not to be seen, but to rest. Behind that door, there was little glamour, little noise, only a shared room and a narrow bed and quiet sighs of other women who, like her, had ended another night. But tonight, as she pushed open the door, she felt different. Not changed, not renewed. Such grand words didn't suit her, but somehow steadier, like a tree that had weathered another night of wind and still stood tall in the pale hush of dawn. As she lay down upon her narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket up around her shoulders, Lucilia let her eyes close slowly, not as a retreat but as a soft surrender. The room was dim, the silence full. The memories of the evening lingered only faintly now, not sharp, not sorrowful, just floating gently behind her thoughts like the dust caught in moonlight. And as sleep welcomed her, she breathed once more, slow, deep, and free. So now, as you listen, let your eyes close too. Let the flickering lamps in your mind go out one by one, until only the softness remains, the quiet and the peace. You are safe now. You are home in the calm. Good night from the sleepy historian.